Okay, I think we're ready to go. My name is Louise Walker. I'm Senior Research Manager for CIRIA and susdrain. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on nutrient neutrality, issues, impacts and solutions. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping points. Today's webinar is being recorded. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any problems with your connection or audio, please raise your hand and one of our CIRIA team will help. There'll be plenty of time for questions during the webinar. Simply type your questions into the Q&A box and state if you wish to direct your question to a particular speaker. We'll monitor the questions as they come in. Click the thumbs up to like other attendees' questions. This helps us to identify which ones are most popular. Please share any results you have in the chat and share your views and experiences with us using the hashtags nutrient neutrality, water and habitats. We aim to finish at 5:15. Can I just check with the events team that we could put on caption, please? I think we have a request to do that.
Could you please repeat that, Louise?
Could you please use the captions function so that for our hard of hearing delegates, please?
I'll look into that straight away.
Thank you. I just want to say a quick thank you to all our susdrain partners and supporters, without whom events such as today's would not be possible. And then I'll hand over to our chair for today, Peter Bide, who is Urban Working Group Chair at CaBA, the Catchment-Based Approach.
Oh, thank you very much, Louise, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, why are we all here today? Well, what we're going to look at today is what is all about nutrient neutrality, what it is, what it means in practice, and how we can achieve it. And as you've probably seen in the introductory material for this webinar when you signed up, the issue is that lots of lakes, rivers, estuaries, wetlands, and other sites dependent on water are important and protected habitats. And nutrients, things like nitrates and phosphates, support excess growth of algae and vegetation, which are very damaging to the natural water environment because they outcompete the natural vegetation and reduce the oxygen supply to the water. So it's crucial that these habitats aren't destroyed or adversely impacted by new development, as this new development brings with it potential sources of nutrient input. And water companies are required under the Environment Act to assess the environmental impacts of the sewage system, including the impacts of nutrient loads from wastewater treatment works on protected sites. And Natural England states that development plans can be considered nutrient neutral where they can demonstrate that they will cause no overall increase in nutrient pollution affecting specified habitat sites. So this webinar is going to set the scene and examining the issues from several points of view. From the point of view of national regulators, people like Natural England, who are concerned about the impact of nutrients on water quality and habitats, and are developing resources to support those involved in the planning and development process. But it's also going to look at local planning authorities who decide whether to grant planning permission for development. And last but by no means least, water and sewage companies who need to plan for the management of nutrients at designated sites. So our speakers today will share practical approaches to manage nutrients using wetlands and sustainable drainage systems, that's SuDS, as well as guidance from the Rivers Trust and CIRIA. And I think you've all seen the programme today. We're going to have three presentations up to about 3:20, and then we're going to have a short interactive discussion and Q&A on what we've heard from those first three speakers. Then we'll have a short break, only about 10 minutes or so, just enough time to make yourselves a cup of tea or coffee. And then after that, come back at around about 20 to 4, and we're going to have 3 more presentations, followed by a further discussion and Q&A covering the whole of the whole range of presentations you've heard today and issues arising from those. Then I'll sum up about 5:10, and we aim to finish by 5:15. So that's where we are today, and our speakers today. I'm delighted to be joined by Simon Thompson, who's the Principal Advisor for Strategic Solutions at Natural England, Rachel Jones, who's Ecology Manager for Wiltshire County Council, Sarah Mollen, who's Technical Policy Advisor, Water and Wastewater Strategic Planning in Northumbrian Water, David Johnson, who's Technical Director at the Rivers Trust, Dr. Louise Walker, who's a Senior Research Manager at CIRIA. You've already heard from Louise. Joe Bradley, who's UK Director of Operations for Stormwater Shepherds, Phil Williams, who's a Technical Director at the Environment Protection Group, Dr. Martina Gervin, who's a Technical Director at Arcadis, and Renuka Gunasakura, who's also Technical Director at Arcadis. So without further ado, we'll move on to the first session. So I'd like to start with the first presentation by Simon Thompson. As I said, Simon's Principal Advisor for Strategic Solutions at Natural England. And he's going to tell us about the issues regarding nutrient neutrality. So, Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Peter's already highlighted, I'm going to talk to you about the issues, the environmental issues that have led to Natural England issuing advice around nutrient neutrality, and what those impacts are, and how that's affecting our natural environment. So, as I'm sure you'll know, the issues that we're primarily talking about when we talk about nutrient neutrality are excessive levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water environment. So I've used some examples here just to illustrate some of the issues that can cause. So in the Solent, elevated nitrogen levels lead to algal mats forming in the intertidal areas of the estuaries and harbours within the Solent area, which damages plant diversity. And one of the specific issues in the Solent is the prevention of wading birds accessing the intertidal mud for feeding. To give an example on the of a site that's affected by phosphorus, the Somerset Levels and Moors, again, causing broadly the same issues, as is always the case with excessive nutrients, of overgrowth of particular dominant plants and algae, which leads to the loss of plant diversity in the margins of watercourses, and also reduces oxygen levels in the water, which left unchecked can lead to further harm, such as death of fish. And it's not just the wildlife that's degraded as a result of excessive nutrients, it's also unsightly and odorous, in addition to the ecological impact. So this infographic's really just to highlight the range of different impact pathways that leads to excessive nutrient levels in the water environment. You've got the two primary sources, which are wastewater treatment works and agriculture, but you've also got nutrients lost through surface runoff from both new development and the urban landscape, and that the pathways can be through groundwater, surface water, as well as the direct and indirect discharges from the major sources. So obviously, and I'm sure the majority of the people on the call today are very familiar by now with what nutrient neutrality is, but I thought it was helpful just to go back and remind ourselves what we're talking about when we talk about nutrient neutrality. Essentially, we are talking about offsetting the impact of new development by reducing the nutrient levels from an existing source. So essentially, any new proposal consumes its own smoke. So we're not talking about an approach which is going to solve the problem. All it is doing is stopping things getting any worse, and therefore enabling decision makers, planning authorities, to grant planning permission for further activities in areas where otherwise the environmental regulations would mean that it would be very challenging to grant further activity, which is going to further harm sites which are already impacted by excessive nutrients. And then practically, to demonstrate whether or not a development or a plan or project is going to have an impact requires nutrient neutrality. A nutrient budget is calculated, and that nutrient budget will either show that the development won't have an impact, or it will identify the scale and size of mitigation that would be required to neutralize the additional burden in terms of nutrients that would be generated by that proposal. So why have we got to the point where we need an approach such as nutrient neutrality? Unfortunately, water quality has been in long-term decline over decades. As I've touched on already, the primary reasons are diffuse pollution from agriculture and point source pollution from the effluent discharged by wastewater treatment works, and new development further exacerbates an existing problem. So what this slide is trying to illustrate, and obviously these are not to scale, these really are illustrative, but essentially we've reached a point where we are in certain areas significantly above the capacity of the natural environment. We are just discharging too many nutrients, or too many nutrients are finding their way into watercourses, and therefore there isn't any capacity for the new growth that is being delivered. So over time, where we need to get to is a situation where the existing pollution levels are low enough that there is still capacity for new growth without exceeding that environmental capacity. And obviously, once we reach that point, there wouldn't be a need for mitigation. The growth could go ahead and would not be having a damaging effect on the natural environment. However, in the meantime, nutrient neutrality is designed to enable growth to continue without breaching those environmental limits. Another way to put this, which a colleague often uses, is to treat it as essentially for the last number of decades, we've been spending our environment like an unarranged overdraft. And we've reached such a point now that you just can't continue to extend that environmental debt. And therefore, measures have to be taken to bring that under control and enable the environment to recover. And just to point out, the image there, as it's captioned, is Poole Harbour, and that's just another illustration of algal mats in the water environment. So again, apologies if I am covering information that you're all aware of, but thought it was helpful just to again clarify what we're talking about when we talk about mitigation at a sort of a policy level. They're protective measures intended to avoid or reduce direct negative effects that might be caused by a new development proposal, or indeed any other plan or project that requires assessment. So it's an important point to highlight that it is about avoiding the impacts of the new development. This is why there's some complexity and challenge around the location of mitigation. It has to be in the right place so that it avoids there being an impact to one of the protected sites. If the development and the mitigation don't relate to each other geographically in the appropriate way, you can end up with improvements to one reach of a river and degradation to another, which the environmental regulations don't allow. So when you hear discussion about location of mitigation, that's why that's so important. Generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, if the mitigation is upstream of the development, you're likely to be okay. It also needs to be certain. So it's got to be effective and be in place for as long as the impact occurs. So this is why it can sometimes be challenging to use planning conditions for mitigation. I'm not saying that there aren't times when that is entirely appropriate, but you have to have certainty that whatever's being proposed is secured and is going to be effective before you can make your decisions. And obviously nutrient neutrality is just one form of mitigation, which has obviously been proposed to avoid an overall increase in nitrogen or phosphorus. Given the organisations that have organised today, I thought I would touch specifically, albeit briefly, on SuDS. SuDS can be useful in a number of ways when it comes to nutrient neutrality. Firstly, a well-designed development proposal that incorporates SuDS can reduce the nutrient loss from surface runoff from new development. So you start from a better position because assuming mitigation is required, there will be less mitigation required as a result of SuDS interventions on site. And Natural England have been working with CIRIA and Wiltshire Council to define the rates of reduction from surface runoff of phosphorus that they can deliver, and that will be published imminently. SuDS can also be used as a mitigation measure. So where there are developments that don't benefit from SuDS, they can theoretically be retrofitted to those developments to offset the nutrients coming from new developments. So it can be also used as a mitigation measure as well as an avoidance measure to reduce the mitigation requirements from a new development itself. Again, I thought it would be helpful to clarify Natural England's role here. So our statutory purpose is to ensure that the natural environment is conserved, enhanced and managed for the benefit of present and future generations, thereby contributing to sustainable development. In practical terms, we have a number of roles, but of relevance to this area, we've got two primary roles. One, we're the government's advisor for the natural environment. So we work with government, we advise government about environmental issues, appropriate responses, etc. Primarily through DEFRA as our sponsor department, but we do engage across government. We're also a statutory consultee in the planning system. So local planning authorities would consult us prior to giving, or during the assessment of planning applications, prior to granting planning permissions, if those planning proposals have the potential to impact the natural environment or designated sites. So through the consultation with Natural England, LPAs are able to ensure that they correctly exercise their function and only authorise new development where they do not have adverse effects on designated sites. But it is the LPA that carry out those assessments and make those decisions, albeit obviously taking account of the advice that they receive from Natural England. And this is, I think, an important point to touch on, the scope of Natural England's direct advice. So we have our statutory responses to planning applications are our primary mechanism for directly influencing potential impacts on designated sites. And that obviously means that it's only those types of development that require planning permission that are generally subject to that, although other competent authorities do undertake assessments, and we are a statutory consultee on those as well. But that leaves a lot of activity, such as a lot of agricultural activity, for example, that generally falls outside of that process. And that's where Natural England's engagement directly with government to advise and influence policy comes in. So that's why we have to take different avenues to a degree for different sectors. So what is our advice and where does it affect? So the map on the right hand side there shows the catchments where Natural England have advised local planning authorities that new development needs to be considered through environmental assessment because those sites are in unfavourable condition and nutrients is a particular issue and a reason for that unfavourable condition, and therefore proposals that could add additional nutrients to those protected sites should be assessed prior to any planning permissions being granted. So our advice covers, or I'll actually go from the bottom up there. The requirements to assess applications for environmental impact, so habitats regulations assessment, is a requirement for all types of development. However, we very much recognise that a significant proportion of planning applications relate to residential. So that's why the tools we've provided are specific to overnight accommodation. And that includes reserve matters approvals, generally excludes business commercial developments, because where it can, unless there's a specific reason why those types of development would attract people from outside of the catchment itself, there is a risk otherwise of double counting if you're looking at where people live for an impact and also where they work. So that's why there's that exclusion in there. Also generally excludes householder applications. So we're talking about additional dwellings, not minor changes to existing ones. Again, important to highlight that this is not intended to be a moratorium on house building. It's about the right developments in the right places and the right types of development. So in that sense, it means that you have to consider whether the impacts can be avoided or mitigated prior to granting permission. I appreciate that in reality, in practical terms, it has felt like a moratorium on house building. It's a matter of delay rather than stop. But the reality is that delivering mitigation is complex and does take time. So we fully recognise that there has been an impact and a delay to being able to bring things forward. And finally, just to touch on the longer term solutions and some of that wider work beyond the planning system. So there are a number of things that are going on or have recently been announced that will help to improve the situation with regard to pollution in the water environment. There's obviously the duty on water companies to produce drainage and sewage management plans, which we're seeing coming forward at the moment. It says possible there, it's hopefully a little bit more certain than that now, but the duty on water companies to achieve technically achievable limits at wastewater treatment works in sensitive catchments. There's the strategic policy statement to Ofwat, requiring that nutrient pollution is considered in line with environmental duties. The government has also asked water companies to bring forward activities as quickly as possible. Then on the agricultural side, we are seeing a significant increase in EA inspections and the number of EA inspectors, changes to farming rules for water, the slurry storage investment scheme, which is either has just been or is about to be launched, and the nutrient management standard for the sustainable farming incentive. So that there is a lot of action going on. Unfortunately, those actions need to work together and be coordinated in order to get us where we need to get to. Where the end point we need, well, obviously the end point we need to get to is our watercourses being in good condition. The important step on the way to that, though, is having plans in place which demonstrate that that can and will be achieved, and that's sort of the gold star moment at which the need for nutrient neutrality would be removed and development could come forward as it previously could. And I'll stop there if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. That was a really good introduction. We'll now move on to the planning side of it. So I'm now going to introduce Rachel Jones, who, as I said, is Ecology Manager at Wiltshire Council. And Rachel's going to tell us about the planning side of this, of planning impacts on nutrient neutrality. But before she does, I just want to say one thing. Can you make sure that your questions are going into the Q&A rather than the chat, because we can't really monitor what's happening in the chat in terms of bringing them forward, bringing questions forward at the for the Q&A session. And can you also like the questions you see, which sort of chime with what you're thinking and questions you might have been thinking about asking, because that'll help us rank them so that we can bring the most popular questions to the top of the list when we start our Q&A session after these three presentations are finished. So without further ado, Rachel, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to move forward. So thank you. I'm Rachel Jones. I'm the Ecology Manager at Wiltshire Council. So I'm leading on the nutrient neutrality strategy that we are adopting within our area. I'm also on a part-time secondment with the Planning Advisory Service, which is part of the Local Government Association. And that's to help the 74 authorities affected by nutrient neutrality by setting up a national network. So today I'm just going to give the local planning authorities' perspective on nutrient neutrality. So to cover the impacts, give some examples of the strategic solutions that we've been working on, talk about some of the complexities, what help is available to local planning authorities, and then thinking about how we can join the dots with wider environmental planning. So just a brief sort of recap of nutrient neutrality across England. So there's 74 local planning authorities that are dealing with nutrient neutrality, and as Simon said, that covers 27 water environment catchments. They were originally split into old and new catchments. So I think the distinction is now blurring as time goes on. But essentially there was around 6 old catchments that were dealing with nutrient neutrality from before and after the Dutch nitrogen case, which was the case law that came forward from the European Court of Justice that led to nutrient neutrality being flagged in certain areas. Some of those catchments have been dealing with water quality issues for a long time. As Simon mentioned, there's a number of areas that have been on sort of continued decline. So local authorities were aware of those issues. For other places, in March 2022, the new catchments came forward when Natural England released updated advice. And for some of those areas, it was a new issue to be tackled. The House Building Federation has done some work on the amount of homes that are affected, and they've estimated that it's around 100,000 new homes. The Local Government Association did a bit of work on the amount of housing supply that has been affected, and nationally it's believed to be around 7%. But there are regional differences because with the different 27 catchments, some are very rural with limited growth coming forward. Others are in areas where there's significant growth and significant amount of houses are impacted. We're also aware from nutrient neutrality that it can have a disproportionate impact on small and medium enterprise builders. So they're often the smaller household builders that are working in certain geographies, certain local areas, and nutrient neutrality has a bigger impact on them and a bigger impact on how they can find solutions. That also has wider impacts on the local economy in terms of construction work, etc. For some authorities, nutrient neutrality has also influenced where growth can come forward within their areas. If there has been a moratorium on planning applications in part of the local authority area, then speculative development has come forward in other areas, and that can cause problems for local authorities. So nutrient neutrality is only maintaining the status quo. So it's only addressing the impact from new growth. It's not tackling the background problem that has been identified in terms of water quality issues. But even that is very difficult. It's a very technical and it's a very complex issue. For some local authorities, as I mentioned, there was no early warning of the issue. Others have been aware of water quality. But for everyone, there's been very much a steep learning curve. Often in local authorities, planners and ecologists will be aware of broader protected species issues, but they wouldn't necessarily be specialists in water quality. So different skill sets are needed. It's obviously had a huge impact on planning applications, and that's largely been housing. And we're very grateful for the methodology that Natural England have provided to help assess nutrient burdens from housing. But local authorities can also be dealing with other complex applications like agricultural intensification, and bespoke approaches are needed. So extra work is needed to try and evaluate what the nitrogen or phosphorus burden is from those planning applications. Similarly, mitigation solutions are very complex and they're evolving all the time. For some authorities, we've been working on nutrient neutrality for 4 years, and different solutions are coming forward, and we're evaluating evidence and trying to evolve those into practical solutions. Because of the extra work that is available in evaluating applications and assessing mitigation, at best there is a slowing down of the planning application system, and that's if there are mitigation solutions. Without solutions, there has been, unfortunately, moratoriums in certain areas and planning applications have been stopped. As I said, this can redirect planning applications out of nutrient neutrality areas. Nutrient neutrality has been another pressure on quite a resource-stretched system for local authorities. And this slide is really just to highlight that a bit further. So the snake is basically to represent the water eutrophication problem in catchments, and often it is huge, perhaps not fully evaluated in terms of its scale. With a very small amount of local planning authority resource, nutrient neutrality permeates further than just development management issues. It stretches into obviously local plan and 5-year housing land supplies. but it can also impact obviously communities and economy, and then that can lead to lots of communications with local authorities, so those teams are stretched. And then in looking forward for solutions, it brings in the monitoring team and the legal and government teams as well. So what I want to do now is just run through sort of the nutrient neutrality impact for Wiltshire ourselves, just because obviously I've got most knowledge about that. There's 4 areas that are affected within Wiltshire. The 2 main ones I'm focusing on, the biggest is the Hampshire Avon. So that's an internationally important chalk river, and it's very sensitive to phosphorus burdens. We've been aware of the water quality issue for a number of years. It's been, it has been a difficult problem that the council has been addressing. Around 40% of our local planning authority area is affected, and we have about 2,000 houses up to just 2025. So that's just for the current development plan period that need to be phosphorus neutral. Housing was held up for around 9 months before we managed to get a solution in place, and I'm going to talk a little bit further about what that was. The solar protected sites, we also have a small part of Wiltshire that's within the River Test catchment and drains to the Solent. It's around 300 houses, and that's just for this local plan period, and we were held up for about 18 months. Now, the Solent issue was relatively new to Wiltshire. It hadn't been something that had been flagged in previous local plans. So when we had a letter from Natural England after the Dutch case in around 2020, I think it was, housing was then held up for 18 months until we managed to find a solution. The other 2 areas that we're dealing with are very rural, and they've got very limited development, so we're not looking for a strategy for those areas. Where we wanted to get to when we received the news that we needed, all development needed to be nutrient neutral, is we wanted to get to a funded mitigation strategy for the council. So effectively that has the appropriate resource and funding to deliver the mitigation. That needs network and collaboration. It needs the guidance and tools as well as the money. And we get to the point where water eutrophication is still a big problem. We're only addressing the growth, but perhaps we have a better understanding of the scale of that problem, and we have a way forward to help planned growth be delivered as it is needed. So how's it going? I'm going to firstly touch on the nitrogen strategy, because mitigation does tend to be easier for nitrogen rather than for phosphorus. It did take us a long time to get a solution in place, but we were lucky enough to own a strategic farm, 120 hectare dairy farm in basically an ideal place for mitigation for nitrogen for the Solent. So we were very fortunate in that respect. The tenant was looking for a new farm out of the area, so the tenancy renewal came up, and we had an opportunity to restore the land to a chalkgrass and nature reserve. And that ticks a lot of boxes in terms of wider people and wildlife benefits. We wouldn't advocate wholesale changes in agricultural land production in all cases, but where it can deliver effective mitigation as an isolated project, then it has been a worthwhile project for us to bring forward, and it's very exciting. It has taken a lot of resource to deliver it, but it's all within our council's control, and we're now at the point where we have, a good strategy for growth coming forward with capacity for local plan review if we need it, and we're able to deliver something with the community that is very beneficial for nature recovery as well as for nutrients. The phosphorus strategy has been much more tricky, and it's much more complex. So we do have a strategy in place for planned growth from 2018 just to 2025, and it's an in-house scheme, and we've ring-fenced funding from our community infrastructure levy, and that is to pay for officer resource and also to pay for projects. We also track where applications are coming forward and where we're anticipating growth in each year to inform the location of mitigation. So the Hampshire Avon, it covers 40% of our LPA area, so it's a big impact on us for our growth. We also have in Wiltshire 80% of the housing that's coming forward within the catchment itself. We have all of the headwaters, so there's an awful lot of tributaries. They are all designated. We're obviously on the chalk, so we have free draining soils, and that can make it harder to find mitigation. As Simon said, mitigation does have to be upstream of certain points of impact. So for us, it has been really important to have a strategic approach. It's been essential. If we'd left it to the market, we may well have had a mitigation project on one tributary. It would have been very difficult to allow us to bring forward the growth that we had planned for at the right time, without having a sort of a strategic funded approach that we've got at the moment. And it relies very much on temporary measures. So the idea is that we're funding cover crops and fallowing, as well as temporary improvements with our packaged treatment plants. So we've got council owned packaged treatment plants. So they're the temporary measures, and they allow us to spatially cover the whole catchment. They allow us to bring forward it as housing is being occupied, but to give us time for us to deliver those permanent solutions. We have had this solution in operation now for a couple of years. We're also exploring other temporary options, so working potentially with the water companies as well, and evolving our solutions for packaged treatment plants. They're evolving all the time. So that's been really beneficial for our strategy. The permanent measures are taking a lot longer. We have 3 feasibility assessments for constructed wetlands that are being progressed by the council. It's taking a bit of time. There's lots of third-party agreements. So it's been really useful that we've had the temporary measures in place already. The packaged treatment plant work that we're doing, we've got a trial in place with Kingspan Clargester, looking at aggregate beds. We're doing some real-world monitoring, and that's something, because we're lucky again to own a number of packaged treatment plants across the catchment, that we can roll out further. We've obviously been involved with the SuDS work, and so we are looking for developers to avoid and mitigate as much as possible on site, so that there is limited mitigation that then needs to be addressed off-site. And we're constantly looking for other mitigation options. So we're looking at short rotation coppice and interceptor woodlands, trying to work out how these different options can come forward, just to help have a selection of mitigation that can form part of the strategy, given the complexity of our catchment. So phosphorus mitigation is really difficult. I've mentioned many of the different approvals that are needed and the permitting and licensing, etc. We are finding that it's very much evolving, and there's a changing evidence base for mitigation. So we need to be on top of sort of the latest levels that have been agreed. I think an important element that local planning authorities have to do, the sort of their role is to, as a competent authority, is to monitor and enforce any mitigation in perpetuity. So elements can be agreed with Natural England, and then the obligation falls to the local authority to be able to monitor and enforce that. That in itself can be quite complex, and it can need a lot of resources. And I think it's really important that discussions are ongoing with local planning authorities when bespoke mitigation are being considered, just so that all of those different elements have been properly considered. Given the complexity that we're finding with phosphorus mitigation, I think strategic approaches seem very important, seem essential in our case. And yeah, but a lot of work is happening across the different areas, and certainly from working with the Planning Advisory Service, the knowledge sharing between catchments is helping, and it is benefiting everyone. So just to touch further on that support, so each catchment got £100,000 from the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Community, and that was to help with initial costs, potentially to get resource, to get evidence-based studies as well. We're having regular catchment meetings between local authorities and wider conversations with DLUC and DEFRA and Natural England, etc. We're also collaborating with partners like the Rivers Trust and CIRIA to look at those mitigation solutions, and to look at how we can help progress strategies and progress ways forward for development. Simon touched on the recent update for the wastewater treatment works. So that's going to potentially be very beneficial for developers and local planning authorities because it reduces the burden that we need to offset with these strategic solutions. There's also the Natural England Strategic Mitigation Scheme that's coming forward that will help some catchments in certain areas this year and then looking forward in other catchments as well. But I think most local authorities recognise that they need to join the dots. So some are dealing with nutrients, most will be dealing with biodiversity net gain, a lot have identified carbon, a climate emergency, so we're looking at carbon offsets as well. Then flood alleviation and water resources issues are also common across local planning authorities. So we've got lots of partnerships, we've got lots of strategies, we've got more things coming forward with the Environment Act, like the Local Nature Recovery Strategy. So we've got lots of different elements of an environmental planning that are important to consider more holistically, both at site levels in terms of getting best practice, local plan, looking at the LPA level and the different strategies that can come forward for green infrastructure and where houses should be delivered. But I think the key thing for environmental planning is looking across LPA boundaries, looking at that regional level. Most of the river catchments are more than one local planning authority, so we need to have a sort of a more regional scale of planning to help deliver those solutions or deliver collaboration across local planning authority boundaries. And we need to do that in the most effective and efficient way, given everyone's resource constraints as well. So this is where local authorities are wanting to get to, because fixing our rivers and our estuaries and fixing the house building problems, they're distinct, but they're co-joined issues. I think it's recognised that just fixing the neutrality, getting a mitigation strategy, well, that's the first stop. But unless we fix our rivers and estuaries, we will always need to have some form of neutrality strategy. So it's about going further and getting that collaborative approach. But local authorities are just one of a number of stakeholders, and we are looking to how we can all work together more collaboratively to try and get those restoration strategies in place. So just a few reflections to finish on. We're very conscious that nutrient neutrality is only maintaining the status quo. That said, it has taken a lot of time and money just to get to where we are. And I think one of the questions is whether we are channeling it in the right way. Are we giving the right issues the right resources? And certainly looking at much more collaboration and much more catchment, sort of strategic catchment planning that can help make sure the mitigation that we are progressing with is in the right place, and we can steer the opportunities for multiple benefits and to help plan further for a better environment going forward. So thank you for allowing me to speak today. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. That was a tremendous sort of tour de force of the planning issues. And I'm very pleased to see that we're actually beginning to make some progress on this. So I first raised the issue about the problems in the Hampshire Basin in relation to delivering housing with ministers 15 years ago. So and it's taken a long time, but I think we are managing to get there, and we're realizing that we need to build houses, but we also need to protect the environment, to protect water quality is a really hard balancing act. So we've heard about the issues from the regulators' point of view. We've heard about the issues from the planning point of view, and now I'd like to introduce Laura Mollen, who's going to tell us about the issues from the water point of view. Laura's the technical policy advisor for water and wastewater strategic planning at Northumbrian Water. So, Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about the impact of nutrient neutrality to Northumbrian Water from a northeast perspective. So within the northeast area, we have 2 designated sites. Both are designated for nitrogen only, so not nitrogen and phosphorus like a lot of other areas, or just phosphorus by themselves. The first is Lindisfarne, which is just south of Berwick upon Tweed. It contains the water bodies of Holy Island and Butel Bay, and has got very interesting geomorphology as you go down the coast, which we think actually impede some of the coastal flow. There's a colleague from Natural England there holding some of that excess macroalgae that grows on the mudflats and impacts the birds. Our next site is the Tees management catchment. So this is one of the largest areas that has been designated for nutrient neutrality, and the area impacted is quite a small area of the estuary called Seal Sands, which is the picture just on the left. The whole of the Tees management catchment covers a lot of local authority areas. So from Cumbria, County Durham, Darlington, Hartlepool, Stockton Tees, Middlesbrough, North Yorkshire, Redcar and Cleveland. So it covers a very vast, large area, and most of the impact is actually at the bottom. So where is the nutrients coming from? So for nitrogen, this graph is taken from the dynamic combined phytoplankton macroalgae model that the EA and CFAS own. So from there, you can see about 40% of that loading comes from sewage treatment works. About 52% comes from industrial discharges direct into the estuary, and about 8% of that comes from agriculture. The Tees is a bit unique in that most of the other catchments agriculture is one of the largest sources going into the areas, but actually for this area, it is point source discharges direct into that estuary area. Of the freshwater loading that makes it into the impacted area, about of that, only about 10% makes it onto the protected area, and of that 10%, about 8 of that is from agriculture, and about 2% of that is point source discharges. The other 38% are sewage treatment works that go directly into the estuary or coastal areas. Okay, so for Lindisfarne, it's a bit unique. It's a very, very rural catchment. And from the modelling that the Environment Agency have undertaken for this, we believe about 87% of that is what's called offshore background loading, and about 13% of this actually comes from the freshwater catchments that go on directly into the protected area. Of that 87%, we think actually the Tweed that comes down from Scotland impacts that, and the unique geomorphology across, I don't know if anybody's ever driven across the Holy Island causeway, but we think because of the geomorphology there, that also impacts. From that, you can see that the predominant source there is agriculture. Sewage treatment work discharges make up less than 5%, and all of that, not all of them are mains drainage, so there's quite a rural catchment. There's lots of package treatment plants, little holiday caravan parks and that sort of thing. There is also background sources from different birds and seals that will contribute to the loading, as well as atmospheric nitrogen deposition as well. Okay, so you might have heard about the Levelling Up Bill. So the Levelling Up Bill has basically had an amendment put to it, which is still going through Parliament at the moment. The impact of that bill is that for us, 49 of our sewage treatment works in these catchments will have to be upgraded to the technically achievable limit for nitrogen at basically the end of pipe. So basically where we discharge, we will have a 10 milligram a litre total nitrogen consent. The cost of this is £653 million CapEx. So basically that's the capital build. Then there'll be about a £10 million operational cost every year. This also has really large greenhouse gas emission for it. So essentially, in order to get a total nitrogen limit and to be able to do that down to the technically achievable limit, it essentially means putting on the same sort of civil engineering that already exists. So essentially, it's like creating another sewage treatment works on top of the sewage treatment works that are already there. So in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, there's about 36,000 tonnes of CO2 and about 6,000 tonnes of CO2 per year for the operational of that. There will also be NOx emissions and potentially methane emissions from that activity. Basically, we're limited through that legislation to only do end of pipe. It removes the option from any catchment and nature-based solutions that we're looking forward for not just nutrient neutrality, but also all our other environmental obligations. We'd really like to do these catchment and nature-based solutions, but it limits our opportunities if all of these catchments are designated. It still requires offsetting from developers. So although it'll be a 27 milligrams down to 10, that's about a 63% reduction. There still will be that 10 milligrams a litre for developers to offset as well. It removes Northumbrian Water from being that catchment facilitator, which we've spent a lot of time and energy to basically build up these catchment partnerships and work with everybody within these catchments. We've got a very close relationship already with Natural England, with the Environment Agency, and with all the partners in those areas. It would take up to 2030 for completion for these to all be built. And even then, we actually may struggle to be able to essentially put all the concrete in the ground that we would need to be able to construct these. This is 49 sewage treatment works. With that, on top of all of the other plans that we have to do going forward for investment, it would be a really tough thing to achieve by 2030. So what would we like to do essentially instead? So we are looking at alternative solutions. So in tandem, we're looking at all the hard structural civil engineering works, but we're also looking at what can we do for these catchment and nature-based solutions, and would they be able to offset the same value? So this is a picture of outline design for some salt marsh restoration scheme. Salt marsh restoration has got the potential to reduce about 83% of the concentrations moving through the area. Integrated constructed wetlands, so this is a little outline of Greetham sewage treatment works, which ends up going directly onto the protected area. We'd like to look at putting in an integrated constructed wetland, and the salt marsh restoration sits right alongside that. So we'd like to integrate both of that together, and we think we could get up to about 50% reduction from the constructed wetlands. Other things we would like to look at is some of the arable offsetting. So following on from what was said earlier, we're very keen to protect that food security. So it only makes sense really to offset agricultural loading in those places. So as you can see, the bits that I've highlighted there would be ideal for offsetting. So if we're going to target arable offsetting, I think it makes sense to target that directly around where the protected areas are. Therefore, it will have a larger impact on restoring those protected areas. Another solution we're looking at is seaweed and shellfish farming. So this has the potential to remove about 90 kilograms per hectare per year. So I've highlighted some areas that are just set off of the estuary itself, but we can also hang long lines along some of the hard engineered flood defences and port sides that will be able to be removing both nitrogen and phosphorus from that area. Another thing we're looking at is native oyster bed restoration. So again, this removes about 90 kilos per hectare per year. We can see there some of the coastal areas that have already been highlighted by Natural England and the Environment Agency, but there are further areas within the estuary itself as well. Okay. And we're also looking at seagrass restoration. So seagrass restoration within the main estuary itself can remove approximately around 35 kilos per hectare per year from that area. And the Tees Rivers Trust have already set up a seagrass nursery, which we want to work with them going forward to do more of the seagrass restoration within the estuary area itself. And the other thing that we're looking at is, so this is our pilot treatment plant, and this is microalgae. So this is a unique species of microalgae that was found at Bransands sewage treatment works. We've upgraded this to a pilot scale plant at the moment. can actually remove up to about 85% of total nitrogen and also removes phosphorus at the same time. We'd like time to be able to scale up larger pilot scale things like the microalgae treatment plant. Okay, so why do we want to be able to do alternative solutions? So the main reason for that is the creation and enhancement of habitat. So water quality isn't the only thing affecting bird species. So it's very important that we take a holistic approach to that. We've also got the carbon sequestration potential of a lot of these solutions. If we look at job creation as well, if we were to set up seaweed and shellfish farms along the northeast coastline, that would have a positive impact on jobs for the farming itself, but also the processing of that. There's potential there with all the different things that I've listed. There is a potential to actually offset the same amount of nitrogen that's required to get that site to favourable status. So not just offsetting growth, but being able to restore the site. And it's a lot more cost efficient from customers, as you can see. Otherwise, we'll be paying £653 million. Something like some of these solutions would only cost about £100 million total, but we'll be able to bring in multiple sources of income from different developers and other environmental partners to be able to facilitate that. So essentially, just to sum up, what we're looking for is more of an outcome-based approach rather than prescriptive limits at the end of pipe. We'd like to be able to facilitate the new WINET methodology, enable these catchment nutrient balancing and nutrient budgets, use what regulation is there more effectively. Is it just sewage treatment works that need to be upgraded, or is there non-mains or industrial sources that also need to have permit reviews? Is it agriculture? Are we making use of all the farming rules for water? Essentially, in summary, we want to be able to put in the right solutions in the right place at the right time, and this needs to be evidence-led. So it's really key that we have, especially for these marine areas, hydrodynamic models to build that evidence base up to make sure that we are deploying the right solutions in the right place at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. That again was a really good presentation and really summarised very succinctly the issues facing water companies with some really good examples of how you're dealing with them and the ideas that are coming forward, particularly in relation to nature-based solutions. We've had 3 fantastic presentations this morning, and I'm very grateful to the speakers for making them so succinct, because we're actually running slightly ahead of time at the moment. So I'm going to go into the Q&A session, the first Q&A session, very shortly. But before I do that, just to update you a bit on the timetable, because as we're running well ahead of ourselves, I think I'm going to bring the break forward. We're due to break after this Q&A session at 3:30. I'm going to bring that forward to 3:20, and then we'll resume again rather than at 3:40. We'll resume again at 3:30, and that will give us more time for the presentations in the afternoon, and also more time for a wrap-up Q&A session, because I want to keep the Q&A for this session largely to the issues raised by our first 3 speakers. And could I ask our first 3 speakers to all unmute themselves and come back on the video, please? Thank you very much. And I'm going to deal with the questions in terms of the number of likes, because we've had a fantastic response in terms of questions. We've got lots and lots of questions, and I'm going to get through as many as I can, but I'm going to prioritize them according to the amount of interest that's been shown by others in the particular questions. But can I just first of all use my chair's prerogative and ask Simon a general question? Simon, could I ask you, in relation to the availability of mitigation in nutrient neutrality catchments, is this causing development to be delayed? I think we all know it is. And what's Natural England doing to help to resolve it?
Yes, as you say, I think probably the primary constraint in most areas is the availability of mitigation. So it was for that reason that Natural England and government decided to put in place the national mitigation scheme that Natural England are currently working up at pace. So that will roll out, that will launch in the new year with some relatively limited mitigation availability between January and the end of March, but then into next financial year, be looking to deliver mitigation on a much larger scale across the affected areas in England. So we're conscious that there needed to be a resolution to that. So we're trying to act to fill the gaps where they exist. But one final thing on that, I think it is important to highlight, we have no intention of going into competition where there are existing schemes. So we'll be looking to fill a gap in provision rather than duplicating if there's already schemes such as those in the Solent, for example.
Yeah, thank you very much. Next question, again, it's really aimed at Natural England. Has Natural England published a final GIS layer of the nutrient neutrality areas, and are you planning on sharing them? And if not, when and why not?
Yes, so the catchment areas for nutrient neutrality are available as one of our impact risk zone layers, which you can access through the Magic platform. However, we haven't at this stage been able to issue just the individual shape files, so the raw GIS data for people to use on their own systems, because of an issue with some metadata, which I confess is way over my head. I apologize, I'm not a GIS expert, but our GIS team are working to resolve it. So we hope to have that resolved and ready to share externally by the time the mitigation scheme formally launches in the new year.
Thank you very much. Next question is about calculating environmental capacity for nutrients. So the question is, how do you calculate, this is for whoever feels like answering it, how do you calculate environmental capacity for nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus? It seems like an impossible task. Who'd like to have a go at that?
I'll come in again. You're right, to actually provide a environmental capacity figure would be incredibly challenging. So what Natural England do is we look at what the capacity is for individual water bodies in terms of the nutrient levels they could sustain whilst remaining in a ecologically natural state. So essentially that is being used as a proxy for the environmental capacity of individual catchments.
Right, thank you very much. Anybody else want to say anything on that one, or shall we move on to the next one?
Sorry, I was just going to add, in terms of local authorities, we would be looking for our local plan. We would have to look at the growth that's coming forward and the capacity for mitigation in order to do habitat regs assessments on our local plan. So we wouldn't be looking, or we would be taking advice from Natural England if the capacity had been exceeded from an environmental, designated site situation. But we would also have to know the impact of our growth coming forward and what mitigation would be available to achieve neutrality.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question, which is, well, there are several aspects to this. The first aspect of this is, are there any examples of SuDS mitigations that have been used for nutrient neutrality? Well, we're going to cover that after the break. There's some really good examples coming up. But if any of our speakers this morning would like to add to anything, that would be good. But also, the questioner asks, could you apply this approach, in other words, SuDS mitigations, to existing highways? And also, when will the advice on SuDS and phosphorus be published? And will nitrates be covered in future? So who'd like to start on any aspects of those three issues there, I think?
Well, I'll just start and then I can pass over.
Yeah.
So in terms of the SuDS guidance that Wiltshire Council Natural England have been working with CIRIA on, my understanding is that it's very almost completed and should be published soon, but Louise can update on the timescales later. I know developers have been looking at a draft version. We haven't seen any come forward right through the planning system in Wiltshire, so it'd be interesting to see if anyone else has. We would be looking at opportunities to offset, to retrofit SuDS in certain situations like highway runoff, provided it's all additional and can be counted over and above what would be expected anyway. Then certainly looking at different types of mitigation and looking at those different sources would be something that we would be interested in as from a council perspective. And I can't remember if there was a third question.
Well, the other bit is how will nitrates be covered? Did I?
Oh yeah, I think that's still. I think the phosphorus work has taken quite a bit of time, and I'm not sure there's a decision yet as to what's happening with the nitrogen. I think it's more complex because nitrogen is more leachy. If that's the word.
Yeah. Anyone else like to add anything on those? I'll move on to the next question. And this is a sort of wider policy question. It takes us onto the sort of other impact side of things, and the question is, what are the overarching negative impacts of taking even more farmland out of food production, especially when we need as much food production as possible, given the current situation in relation to food imports?
I think that's something that's been raised quite a bit with strategies coming forward, in that certainly for the Hampshire Avon, which is a chalk catchment and it's phosphorus, land use change isn't an option for us. We would need far too much land and we still wouldn't be able to deliver the right amount of phosphorus that we need. So we have to look at other options, and wetlands are obviously much less land hungry than land use change. So I think for most of the phosphorus catchments, it's looking unlikely that would happen anyway, and to a certain degree. For nitrogen, yes, it does work a lot better. I think there is value in taking out key land that is less productive, that is in very sensitive locations, if it then can deliver multiple benefits. But it's a really difficult issue, and something because the council has to look at all sorts of different pressures, and you can see the arguments going, both ways on it, really.
Absolutely. Anyone else like to add anything on that one?
Yeah, can I just add in I suppose it's not just about taking agricultural land out of production. I think there's different things that agriculture can be doing to almost deliver the same loading reduction benefits, and that's where the monitoring and the planning of that comes in key, to be able to demonstrate that is having that offsetting impact. But they just need to be able to be given the funding to be able to deliver that. If they need to be changing to, for example, no-till, do they have the machinery upgrades that they need? Are they able to get funding secured to be able to deliver that? And that's where nutrient neutrality can really help the agricultural sector change.
Thank you. Anyone else, or Simon, you happy with that, or shall I move on to the next question? Right. The next question we've got is about, again, this one's for you, Simon. It's do you know if and when Natural England will release mapping data to the public, for instance, shape files, to allow for more detailed assessment of these designated nutrient neutrality sites?
Yeah, I think that one's essentially, well, it's a very similar question to the previous one about GIS data. But yes, we're hoping to get the metadata issues resolved so that we're in a position to share those shape files early in the new year to anyone who would benefit from having that access to them. But as I say, in the meantime, that layer is available online via Magic.
Thank you very much indeed. Right. Let me see where we are with the questions. Yes, this one is about sort of general restrictions on for other pollutions. The question is, after nutrient neutrality, can we expect similar restrictions on other pollutants associated with urban development to come into force? For instance, polyaromatic hydrocarbons from road runoff, as new homes lead to new cars. Any views on that from the three of you? Well, it's really a question for government, isn't it? I mean, there are all sorts of pollutants which are causing the overall problem in terms of environmental capacity. That's whether any of them are specifically problematic in terms of the sort of legislative regulatory approach that we've taken in terms of phosphorus and nitrogen. Any other thoughts?
I think if there's evidence for those impacts affecting certain parts of the designated site, then that would be something that would need to be looked at. But I'm not aware, that would be very presumably small discharges in certain locations. Right.
No, I think it's a case of well, as you say, Rachel, individual sites, but also keeping a very close eye on things from a sort of wider regulatory perspective, DEFRA and Natural England. So anyway, I'll move on to the next one, which is please can you advise if the criteria for unfavourable condition are likely to change? Is there a list or a map of which areas are close to becoming unfavourable? And the questioner says, I'm wondering if and where these new areas will fall under nutrient neutrality.
Well, certainly all of the data on current condition assessments is publicly available off the internet. So we do publish all of the condition assessments, and that includes threats and remedies, or I suppose for sites that aren't currently unfavourable, it would be threats. So there is information out there if we consider nutrients to be threatening the condition of some of our sites. I would caution, however, against just making an assumption that in itself should be seen as an indicator of future nutrient neutrality advice, because obviously that wouldn't necessarily be the case. It would be very specific to the detailed evidence for individual sites.
Yeah. Anyone else before I move on? Right, it's yes, it's a short but interesting one here. If we're changing an agricultural field into a new development with an effective SuDS scheme, does that count as mitigation?
It would certainly reduce any mitigation requirement. I'm probably being a little bit too technical, and well, not technical, but too picky on language, but because it would be part of the scheme, it would affect the nutrient budget, but you wouldn't necessarily call it mitigation. But yes, it would reduce any reduction in the nutrient loss from a development site would be taken into account in the HRA. So yes, it may avoid the need for mitigation and would otherwise reduce the need for mitigation,
which I think underlines the value of SuDS in relation to all new developments. I mean, I'm very pleased that things appear to be moving forward in relation to implementing Schedule 3. And while we're on that, just quickly, can I break in and say that we understand that the amendments the proposals to implement Schedule 3 in relation to SuDS particularly are currently doing a ministerial write round. This is the last stage before they actually come into force, if they come into force. And could I urge everybody who's able to lobby MPs or anybody else, ministers directly, to point out the value of SuDS in terms of mitigating neutrality, and also the other multiple benefits of SuDS, because this is a crucial stage in terms of getting Schedule 3 implemented. And if it gets held up at the ministerial right round, it'll be back to the drawing board. So sorry to have broken in and taken up a bit of time with that, but I think this is absolutely crucial to what we're doing, both here in terms of nutrient neutrality and across the wider spectrum in relation to rolling out SuDS and achieving the multiple benefits from them. So there we are. Anyway, back to the questions very quickly before we break. One more before we break for a coffee and a comfort break. And this is a technical one for you, Simon. The calculation method has input values that are highly conservative compared to actual values, the questioner says. In particular, the PIMP values, 100% for nitrogen, 80% for phosphorus for urban land use export rates. Is Natural England willing to accept alternative, more realistic PIMP values?
So, yeah, the values that are used in the calculator obviously by necessity have to be values that would be precautionary in every eventuality, because they're being applied across the board.
Yeah.
That's not to say that individual developments couldn't put forward alternative values if there was a rationale for doing so, if there was particular features or elements of a development design that meant that alternative values would be more appropriate.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anybody else like Laura, Rachel, say anything before we close for the break?
Not from me, no, thank you.
In which case, thanks very much to all three of you, and fantastic presentations, good answers to the questions, and thanks also to our audience for an amazing array of questions. We've only just begun to touch on them. We'll return to the questions when we have our second Q&A session, and I hope we can pick up ones we haven't answered here when we get to that stage. But for now, could I please take a 10-minute break or so, and can you try and be back? Well, please can you be back by 3:30, so that we can resume? And that gives us a bit more time, a bit more flexibility for the afternoon. So in the afternoon, we've got presentations on how to actually do this in practice, some of the examples of what the case studies of what's actually happening, and then we've got more the final question and answer session. So see you at 3:30. Thanks very much, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a good break, and I hope you're fit and fine to listen to the final three presentations of this webinar. Before the break, we looked at the issues from the perspective of regulation and from this perspective of planning, and also from the perspective of water companies. Now we're going to have three presentations which are going to look at the practical aspects of actually implementing solutions with case studies and examples. And to start this off, I'd like to introduce David Johnson, who's the Technical Director of the Rivers Trust. And David's going to talk to us about one of the solutions, a major solution in terms of nutrient neutrality, which are wetlands. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm part of a large team of wetland designers who've come together to promote the effective use of well-designed and constructed wetlands. That's a group from Rivers Trust, Constructed Wetlands Association, and the Wildfire and Wetland Trust. And earlier this year, Natural England asked us if we would design a framework to help their officers assess wetland assessments, wetland designs as they came in, to see whether they were suitable for nutrient neutrality credits. Designed that and published the framework, and we're hoping that not only will it be useful for the Natural England officers, but also for designers and delivery organisations as well, so they know what what a good wetland, how to design a wetland so that it will effectively remove nutrients and contribute the maximum in terms of credits. So to start with, I just have a few slides on constructed wetlands. So they're simply engineered wetland systems which maximise the natural processes that occur anyway. And one of the things that in our work we had to focus particularly on optimizing the nutrient removal design of the wetlands, but we also incorporated multiple benefits of the wetlands in our framework, because wetlands are so much more than simply pretty treatment work. So that was a key part of our framework. So we kind of identified two types of constructed wetlands. First one is treatment wetlands. They have a much better level, they have a much tighter level of control over them. So there's control over the inputs to those wetlands, control over the outputs, outlets, and also control over the management of those wetlands. Those are treatment wetlands. And then all the other, and what I should have said is that for treatment wetlands, because you've got that level of control, it's much easier to predict the removal efficiency of nutrients within that sort of control system. All the other wetlands, landscape wetlands, have are effective at removing nutrients, but it's much more challenging to identify and to quantify the removal efficiency of those wetlands. And typically we're talking about things like floodplain wetlands and farm wetlands in that case. And the framework itself has sort of four main principles, three that determine the design and one extra one. And the first one, in terms of the design, is confidence in the design approach and the maintenance approach. So what we've helped natural land officers understand is what good design looks like and what a good maintenance plan looks like. And the better the design and the maintenance plan, the more likely to treat the wetland is to provide the nutrient credits that have been calculated. Then we've got flow and nutrient concentration as the second two principles. So again, the better the understanding of the flow inputs, the seasonality of those inputs and the variability, and the same with concentration, the better the design will be, and the much more accurately we'll be able to predict the nutrient reduction that the wetland can achieve. And then the final principle is about the fact that most wetlands will reduce nutrients, whether we can calculate it or not. And this really kind of highlights one of the issues, which is that if we want certainty up front, we really need accurate design and control over the inputs. But as our level of uncertainty increases, as our level of control reduces rather, that uncertainty increases. So the framework also includes monitoring to counteract that. So you can either predict the nutrient removal up front if you've got good control, or if you haven't, you can plan to monitor and prove that it's removed the amount of nutrient that you've identified. And the framework also includes adaptation, which is a key component to make sure that these wetlands, we want them to be in the landscape for the long term, and so they're going to need to be adapted and changed as the situation changes in our catchments. So the wetland framework has kind of 6 steps, and we've done training on each of these 6 steps, which is also published, and I'll give you the link at the end of the talk. In today's talk, I'm going to go through each of these steps just to give a high-level idea of what's within each one of them. But before I do that, I'm just going to go to the actual core of the whole approach. So once you've been through all those 6 steps, you come back to these 3 tables, and each table reflects a different level of confidence in the design that's been submitted. So the top table is based on a high confidence design, and the bottom table based on a low confidence design. And if we just home in on the middle table and one particular cell there, that what it's saying there is that we've got a medium confidence in the level of design that's been submitted. We've got high confidence in the characterization of the concentration coming into the wetland, medium confidence in the flow estimates coming into the wetland. And that means that you can attribute 50% of the calculated nutrient removal to the wetland up front. That's the remaining 50% that you've calculated, it's too uncertain, and so that has to be proved by monitoring. So that's how the kind of framework works. And you can see at the top end of the table, you can see that we've got 100% in that green cell, where that's a really well-designed wetland, well-characterized inflows and concentration. So you can have 100% of the credits that you've calculated there. And then on the bottom table, you can see that there's very little confidence in the design, and so really you're going to have to prove your nutrient removal through monitoring. So the first step of the framework is just getting the core information. There's 6 basic pieces of information that we'd like to see from designers to make sure that we're confident they're collecting the right information. So the source of the water quality, and the water quantity are all important, obviously. It's also key to have the predicted water quality leaving the wetland. So we want to know what target they're trying to achieve at the outlet of the wetland. There's multiple benefits. They're hardwired into our approach because, I mean, we've heard it a number of times from a number of speakers this morning, wetlands, and we want to get the maximum number of benefits from our wetlands, and we want to get that in right at the start of the framework. And then long-term trends in water flow and quality, which could affect the viability of the wetland going forward. So these are only trends that we can predict. They're not sort of trying to look forward to things that are unknowable. So those are the first sort of 6 things that we want to see in an application. The second stage is feasibility. So this is really just a checklist of all the trip hazards that are there that might stop the wetland being constructed, or might increase the costs or compromise its treatment effectiveness. So things like topography, soils, groundwater protection, flood risk, and so forth. So the framework goes through each of those constraints, and we've also produced a hub, which I'll show you at the end, where we collect all the data together so that it's possible for us to see to easily work out what the constraints are. The third step is the outline design process, and there's 4 calculations that need to be done in this third step, which is basically calculate the water balance, make sure that there's enough water in the wetland for all the seasons, so that the wetland is always going to have enough water for the processes to work. Then you've got the hydraulic control, so making sure that the levels are all being calculated correctly, and that the flow through the wetland is going to work. And then estimating the sediment loads and accumulation rates. So those 3 calculations all need to be done at this outline design stage, and of course the final one of calculating the nutrient removal and therefore the associated wetland area. And in the framework, we've identified 3 industry standard approaches for doing that. And I'll put them there on the screen. And what we say is that any one of those calculation methods will give you a good estimate of the wetland area, the treatment area that you need to get the predicted water nutrient removal. But if you want to have that really high quality design, what we say is use at least 2 of those approaches. So you calculate it 2 different ways, and then you use the lesser of the 2 numbers. And that's really good design practice, and it's fairly typical in the engineering world. So now you've got an outline design that's giving you the treatment, the wetland area and depth. And it's time to move on to the detailed design at the next step. So the framework goes through sort of things we'd expect to see about hydraulic performance, water management, vegetation communities, substrate, all those type of things. And that you know, that really lead to you having a detailed design that will work in practice and make the most of the area that you've built. Next step is to do with implementation. You've got a detailed design, you're now going to build it, and in order to get that the wetland to function in the correct way, you want to see a plan for vegetation, the establishment of the vegetation, for the hydrological commissioning, and an outline management plan. And then the final step of the process is a monitoring plan. Now, this monitoring is not there to prove your calculations are correct. What we say is, once if you follow the process in the framework, if you've calculated the removal, that's what your credits can be based on. The monitoring is there really to help identify that the wetland is working as functions. So there's visual checks that you'd expect to make sure there's no blockages and all that type of thing, and then also checks to make sure that the sedimentation is going at the rate we're expecting, so that the wetland gets cleared out at the correct period as identified in the maintenance plan. And then adaptive management, this is where this comes in. So we're, as the long-term sort of performance of the wetland is being maintained and checked by the maintenance plan, we're then seeing whether there's kind of some adaptation is required because changes of input or whatever. This is also the stage where we can demonstrate that because of the uncertainty of the design, we're only allowed 50% of the credits, but the monitoring allows us the remaining ones if the wetland has performed as hoped. So that's the kind of the framework, the 6 steps of the framework, and actually the monitoring summary is here. So we've got pre-construction, commissioning, and post-construction monitoring all sort of set out. So that's the framework, and what we've done is we've published the framework, and we've hosted it on this constructed wetlands hub, which is built by a cat at the Rivers Trust. And the idea is just to try and make sure that the whole point of this hub is to make it as easy as possible for people to design really high quality wetlands with the maximum amount of benefits to everyone. And as part of that process, we put in there a wetland explorer, and there's a little video just running at the moment with Kat showing how you can start accessing each of the data layers that you might want to see. So you just turn the data on and off, and what we've done is put as many of the data layers as possible that that you might need for a design into this map. For example, the questions earlier on about where the catchments are, that's already in this. Well, a version of it is already in this tool. So at the moment, we're just looking at a particular site, and I'm just going to go and see whether there is any information from Natural England on the sort of habitats that they would like in this area. So turn on the layer for the habitat opportunity map. There is, and as you zoom around and pan around that area, you start to see whether there are any places that Natural England, there you can see the polygons there, would prefer to see a different type of, well, they might want to see a wetland kind of habitat, or they might want to see some kind of different habitat. So it's really to try and get all that constraints data in there. What's coming up now is the elevation data, the LiDAR data from the Environment Agency. And there's a little tool in there that helps you just investigate the elevation and see whether the site that you're kind of looking at is going to be suitable for the wetland. So if we then just go on to the next slide, this is what we're thinking of doing, hoping to do in the future is a future development. This is just a mock-up at the moment. So there's 3 wetlands that you can see on this hub at the moment. that have been added. This is just, as I say, a mock-up. And you have the ability to filter those wetlands, so that you can see different types of wetlands. If you're interested in only one sort or another, you can filter it to get the information. And you can find out the basic information that's been submitted about each one of those wetlands. And it's effectively, it's an opportunity to create an asset database of natural assets, of natural capital that's being created. And what is happening here is that we're putting in a new wetland, putting in some basic information about that wetland. This is all just test data, obviously, at the moment. So you can identify, the accessibility of the data. You can identify the location, the type of wetland, who constructed it, the cost, all those kind of information, whatever we think is going to be useful, and the date of construction and completion. And then once you've put that information in, you can submit it, and that's being submitted live as this recording goes on. The link actually to the map is there at the bottom. And if we wait for a few seconds, we'll see that a fourth wetland has now been added to the to the dashboard, so that you can see that we'll have this growing resource of, as each new wetland gets built, it can be put onto the hub, and then we've got this. We can really understand how these wetlands are working and being delivered. And then my final slide really was just on some questions that we've been asked as we've been developing the hub. First one was about, quite often get asked whether how can you possibly allow 100% of the nutrient credits to be credited to any particular design, particularly because it's for the Habitats Directive, which is precautionary. And the answer is that what we're really, if you follow the design process, then we're really looking at the reasonable worst case design. That's how it's all based. So it's a kind of low estimate of the number of credits. If you've done everything properly, then you can get 100% credits. I think I'm probably up in terms of time, so I might skip the other questions and see if they come up in the question session.
Thank you very much indeed, David. That was again very good presentation, and I think it demonstrated to us that wetlands are much more complicated than you think they are in terms of designing them, but they can provide a really good solution. And for our next presentation, I'd like to move on to SuDS as a solution. And to cover this, we've got three speakers working together. We've got Louise Walker, who's the Senior Research Manager at CIRIA, Joe Bradley, who's UK Director of Operations at Stormwater Shepherds, and Phil Williams, who's Technical Director at the Environmental Protection Group. And they're going to tell us about neutrality solutions using SuDS, sustainable drainage systems. So over to you, Louise.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'll just take control of the screen. So we have produced a good practice guide, which is just undergoing some final tweaks and should be released before Christmas. So when I was first contacted to be asked to produce this guide, I wasn't 100% sure we could do it. There's not much data on constructed SuDS in the UK and their ability to reduce phosphorus. And we had quite a short timescale and small budget to deliver the guidance. But then thinking about it, this was a perfect question for CIRIA. It's an industry problem that requires guidance. We know that SuDS improve water quality, and they do this through nature-based SuDS do this through infiltration, capturing sediment, and through plant growth. So the likelihood was that they will reduce nutrients within surface water. And producing this guidance will promote the use of good practice SuDS. So SuDS for managing water quality, in addition to managing water quantity, which a lot of them do at the moment. And this will also deliver the many multiple benefits of SuDS, including providing green space in the form of amenity, helping to reduce the heat locally, and also providing habitat for improved biodiversity. I also had some good contacts who know quite a bit about implementing SuDS, modelling SuDS, and their ability to improve water quality. And we had data from overseas that we could draw on. The driver for implementing SuDS or low impact development or water sensitive urban design, much terminology is used around the world for this approach, but the driver in other places has been more to do with water quality, and this type of approach has been monitored quite extensively, so there was potential to draw on that data. And there's also potential to expand the work, as has been mentioned this morning, to think about other types of pollutants within surface water and how SuDS can improve that as well. So the publication that will be released soon is this one. That's what the front cover will look like. And it was written under contract to Wiltshire Council with some funding and support as well from both of those and from Natural England. So we engaged experts in water quality, SuDS and phosphorus to co-author the guide, and we worked with the Rivers Trust to make sure that we were complementing what was going into the wetland hub as well. And the guide was reviewed by H.R. Wallingford, who lead authors on the SuDS manual. This is a problem, as we know, as we've heard today, is problems of high concentrations of nutrient input entering the receiving water environment and causing eutrophication. And under the habitats regulations, local authorities are required to ensure that new development does not make that problem worse. For example, the River Avon in Wiltshire, which is an internationally recognised river for its diverse flora and fauna. So the objectives of writing the guide are to help minimise the quantity of phosphorus that arises from surface water runoff from new development, and to set out the necessary SuDS treatment trains to achieve good practice phosphorus removal or reduction. So SuDS principles, CIRIA, susdrain, SuDS manual for years have talked about the 4 pillars of SuDS. As I mentioned, water quantity, water quality, amenity and biodiversity. The current standards for SuDS require volume control, but what we want to do is to promote good practice in SuDS, which deliver all of these. And these are also requirements in other areas of planning. So SuDS can provide those multiple benefits, can help with biodiversity net gain, and can help with water quality. So in thinking about SuDS, particularly for water quality management, we can think about taking a management train approach. So we can divide up a development into subcatchments and think about the flow of water across that catchment and how it can be managed within those subcatchments, and think about source control, so managing the rain water close to its source and infiltrating as much as possible and then thinking about site control, using evapotranspiration, using the green environment as much as possible, and thinking about regional control before any runoff enters the receiving watercourse. In developing guidance for reducing phosphorus using SuDS, the quantities that we're looking at are uncertain. We're drawing on overseas data, so we're taking a precautionary approach. But this does represent good practice for surface water management and in delivering the 4 pillars of SuDS. So what we have produced is a work in progress towards definitive recommendations as we get data in from the SuDS that are implemented. The sources of phosphorus, as we've heard, come from different sources, a lot from agriculture, also wastewater treatment and industry, and detergents, household detergents. So in the middle of the 1900s, we started to mine phosphorus in different countries. There's a few sources of rock phosphate, which has continued to be transported to areas of agriculture. So there's more phosphorus than will be naturally available in localized sites. And it's a finite resource, and it's being moved around the world, and it's not going back to its source. So it's a chemical that needs to be managed. And the difficulty in managing it is that it exists in different forms. So dissolved, particulate, and total phosphorus. It can bind to soil particles, so it can be immobilized. But the problem is during if the phosphorus is immobilized within through sedimentation, high intensity storm events can remobilize the phosphorus. So the way that we design SuDS, particularly for this element, we need to take this into account. We need to design in exceedance flows so that any phosphorus captured within the sediment, within SuDS devices, is not remobilized during heavy rainfall. So this is a particular factor to consider when managing SuDS for phosphorus removal. I'm going to hand over to Joe Bradley now, who was one of the authors of the guide.
Thanks, Louise. I'll just wait to take control of that's me. I'm in control. I think whether we can skip a slide back up. It's got a bit of a delay, I'm afraid. Hang on there. That's better. Thank you. So thanks, Louise. I pick up at this point to talk about the principles that we used for designing or identifying the SuDS devices that we could consider for capturing phosphorus. The important thing to remember when we're talking about SuDS and phosphorus is that this is just one small role that good SuDS deliver. So good SuDS do all the other things, the biodiversity, the water quality, water quantity, and all the other pollutants that they capture. So somebody asked in the Q&A if you could justify retrofit SuDS as a mitigation option. And I think probably on a cost benefit analysis that wouldn't work, because you're only considering this phosphorus role of SuDS. But actually, if you consider all the roles of good SuDS, then that suddenly that cost benefit analysis starts to work out right. So just please don't think that SuDS just do phosphorus, they do loads of other things. So the principles that we look at when we are considering design for SuDS, Louise has touched on them already. So we're looking for maximising infiltration, which is good practice SuDS anyway, but we try and use as much infiltration to ground as we can, capturing the sediment, using the vegetation to grow and take up the dissolved phosphorus, potentially using media to capture the phosphorus, depending on the nature of the SuDS device that we're using, managing exceedance flow, so then we swoosh all the phosphorus back out of the device that we've already captured, and then making sure that there's not remobilisation of phosphorus back into the water environment. So the process on site when you're considering SuDS is, these are the first 4 things to think about, and this is really important. And somebody mentioned packaged sewage treatment plants before, and this is something that we used to try and get people installing packaged sewage treatment plants to do as well. And it's difficult to get developers to do this piece of work early on in the design process. But for SuDS for phosphorus, this is essential. So if you're a developer or you're working with a developer who's looking at a site and considering this, they must do trial holes and site investigation as early as possible, because you need to know what sort of soil you've got, how much soil you've got, the topography of the site, the existing phosphorus levels in the existing soils. There's loads of information that you're going to need, and that information will then feed into the calculations that we're going to talk about in a moment. So the first thing you do for your site investigation is work out your soil type, soil permeability, how much phosphorus is already there, and how much infiltration can take place on the site. And that's really, really important. You're looking at soil depth, depth to groundwater, depth of seasonal water table, the vulnerability of the underlying groundwater, connectivity to the underlying groundwater, and the type, location and flow rate of receiving watercourses. That's a lot of information that you need before you can even start to think about designing SuDS. And we need to get that really is putting the horse before the cart and getting it the right way around, so that we're designing good SuDS. So once you've got that information, you need to think about, and Dave's already talked about this for the wetland design as well, what was on site before, how much phosphorus is going to be in your influent, and therefore how much phosphorus can you realistically capture? What will your treatment flow rates be? And there's a whole hour-long presentation in that question. How much infiltration can you deliver? Will you need treatment media, or can you just use engineered soils? How much dissolved phosphorus have you got, and how much particulate phosphorus have you got? Will you be harvesting vegetation? What phosphorus is coming onto your site from neighbouring land? Have you got agricultural land that runs onto your site that you can't divert? And what will you do with your exceedance flows? And on all those things you have to think about before you design anything. So the guide that we've written takes you through those steps and talks about the considerations that you need to go through before you start to design your SuDS management train for your site. And then the other things to think about are, sustainability is really important. And I noticed in the Q&A somebody was talking about constructed wetlands and the amount of engineered construction that takes place. And the same is true for SuDS design. You have to think about the benefits of the SuDS and all those multiple benefits of the SuDS, and then the impact of developing and creating those SuDS. So I'll try and go through this quite quickly, but it's quite complicated. Because of the nutrient neutrality methodology, there is the calculation that you do to look at current land use and future land use, and the difference between the phosphorus load from current land use and the phosphorus load from future land use. And then you work out your phosphorus budget by comparing those two things. And then if you have some phosphorus left that you have to mitigate, which is most likely, then you can use good SuDS to mitigate some of that phosphorus load. You cannot use SuDS to deliver mitigation for all of your phosphorus load from your urban and residential land use, because SuDS won't capture it all, but you can certainly reduce that phosphorus load and therefore reduce the amount that you need to offset. So you use the calculator, you work out what your total annual rainfall is on site and therefore your volume of rainfall on site. You know your runoff coefficient because it's provided in the methodology. So you can work out the mass of phosphorus that will come off your site in a year. Then you work out how much of that you can infiltrate to ground and maximize that. As much as possible should be infiltrated to ground. Then you work out how much of that you can treat in your SuDS. So it won't be all of it, but it'll be a lot of it. And then you work out how much of it will have to go bypass your SuDS in an exceedance rainfall event to prevent flushing all the pollution out. And then finally, you work out what proportion of the phosphorus in the runoff will be removed by your SuDS. And by using all those different calculations, you will end up at the bottom with a figure of the amount of phosphorus left in your urban runoff from your site that must be offset. So it's quite a complicated calculation, but once you get the hang of it, it's quite straightforward. There's lots of different elements. So how much water can you infiltrate? How much water can you treat? How much water will you bypass in high flow conditions? And what proportion of the phosphorus in the treated water will you capture? And that gives you the basis for your SuDS design. So when you're designing a SuDS management train, you need to get your devices in the right order. So you have to have the right devices at the top of your SuDS management train, and then sequentially go through different devices you go down your SuDS management train. So at the top, you will have source control devices, bioremediation zones, permeable pavements, swales, devices like that. Spillage control devices where you need them, although they are unlikely to be necessary on a residential development. Sedimentation devices when necessary, if you've got ponds, basins, wetlands downstream. And then don't forget rainwater capture and reuse, because in our SuDS hierarchy, rainwater capture and reuse is right at the top. So for the purposes of SuDS design, whatever you're doing it for, whether it's for phosphorus management or for all the other benefits of SuDS, rainwater capture and reuse must be right at the top. And remember that, because it often gets overlooked. Once you've done those source control SuDS as much as possible, then you may have secondary components, ponds, basins, wetlands, floating wetlands, and willow beds. There's another whole presentation in the willow beds bit, but those are the devices, the vegetative devices that allow sedimentation and also the uptake of dissolved phosphorus in all that gorgeous vegetation. So they are definitely preferred options for a lot of planning authorities. There are tertiary devices as well available. So stormwater filters are available on the UK market if you need to really get your phosphorus levels down as low as possible, and granular treatment media, which you can incorporate into your SuDS design, which lock up the phosphorus and again give you that extra phosphorus capture and removal efficiency. And then there are all-in-one devices, so devices that do everything, bioremediation zones, doing all those things, doing source control and infiltration and pollution control and phosphorus capture and having vegetation. So everything in one device. So bioretention zones and tree pits distributed across your development deliver all the benefits of SuDS and deliver phosphorus capture as well. So they're definitely a preferred option on some developments. So in the publication, for every one of those different components I've just mentioned, there is a half a page that describes what the device is, roughly how the device works, and gives you a percentage removal efficiency for the device for particulate phosphorus and for dissolved phosphorus. Now, some of you will be looking at that table and be aghast possibly at some of the figures. Please don't blame me, and please don't be too aghast. What we've done is we've used the CIRIA SuDS manual for sediment capture data, which is a reputable source of data. And we've assumed, or we haven't assumed, we've taken some international data that suggests that 55% of the phosphorus is in the particulate phase in urban runoff. So we've assumed that if a sedimentation device captures sedimentary phosphorus, then we can work out the percentage of that phosphorus that will be captured and removed. And that's what's in that second row. So 28% for a swale, for example, 38% for a pond. So those figures are taken from the SuDS manual and converted because we know that 55% of our phosphorus is in the particulate phase. The third row has got a lot of gaps. The reason for that is the only reliable data source for dissolved phosphorus removal in SuDS is the American Best Management Practice database, and we used that document to provide the numbers for that third row. And for some of the devices, you can see there is no number, and that's because there isn't enough data. So I put this back on you lot to gather data. Please gather data on your SuDS, because the more data we get, more British data we get, the more we can create our own best management practice database, and we will be able to populate that third row. But for the time being, from Natural England's point of view, because they require certainty, you're looking at your certain suspended solids figures based on the SuDS manual, and then where there is a published dissolved phosphorus figure from the best management practice database, then you've got both of those. So just two quick examples. This is a pond. This is a beautiful pond, actually. This is a pond on the Broughton bypass near Preston. If anybody lives near Preston, it's worth a visit. Hats off to Lancashire County Council for constructing this. It's a very nice stormwater treatment pond. It has an infiltration capacity of 0 because it's a pond, so it holds water, so it's designed to hold water. Because the SuDS manual says, gives you a figure for sediment capture in a pond like that, we can say that 38% of the phosphorus, 38% of the total phosphorus will be captured, because that's the particulate phosphorus. And because the best management practice database says so, we can say that 50% of the dissolved phosphorus, or the dissolved, 50% of the total phosphorus can be captured because it's in the dissolved phase, which gives us a total phosphorus reduction for that pond of 88% for all treated flows. Now remember that for a pond, for the purposes of phosphorus capture, shouldn't take all flows. It should just take flows that won't cause disturbance of the sediment on the bottom of the pond. So exceedance flows from big rain events should bypass around the pond. So some flows will bypass around the pond, not very many and not very often, but some flows will go around it. So you need to know what your treatment flow rate is and how much of your annual rainfall will be treated by that pond. And once you know that, you can take 88% of that phosphorus away and say you have mitigated 88% of that phosphorus. Sediment removal upstream is essential and must be maintained. That's one of the rules in the SuDS manual. That can be a forebay at the top of the pond, or it can be a manufactured sediment capture device, a separator. So you must make sure you design your pond in accordance with the SuDS manual in order to benefit from all those numbers. And also remember that your pond should also deliver all the lovely multiple benefits of a beautiful pond like that. And then a second example for a tree pit, and again, same sort of calculation. Infiltration capacity for this is high because tree pits are usually unlined, and therefore you have connectivity between the soil in the tree pit and the subsoil underneath. So the water can infiltrate into the tree pit, but then can also infiltrate into the ground beneath. You've also got evapotranspiration. Your phosphorus capture by sedimentation, in accordance with the SuDS manual figures, is 44%, but because there is no data in the BMP database, the dissolved phosphorus capture for a tree pit at the moment in the UK is declared as nil, because there is no figure for dissolved phosphorus removal in a tree pit. And I can only apologise. Like I say, that's back on you lot to do the monitoring and the data capture. The total phosphorus reduction for infiltrated flows is 100%. That's something that we've taken from the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, and so the SuDS guidance that you will see soon says that all infiltrated flows, for all infiltrated flows, you can assume that 100% of the phosphorus is captured and removed. But there's always a but. There are some criteria. So there must be, the soil type must be right, the soil depth must be right, the soil permeability, the flow type through the soil, the vulnerability of underlying groundwater, proximity to water receptors. There's certain criteria that you must satisfy in order to be able to say that all infiltrated flows will capture and retain 100% of the phosphorus. So that's a useful figure, and it's why we're glad it's there, because it pushes designers to maximize infiltration, which is always good for the environment, and it's good for SuDS because it keeps the water where it falls, and then it puts that water back into the local environment. But it's not a catch-all. You must satisfy the criteria in the guide. So if you do all that, your tree pit will capture 44% of the phosphorus in all the treated flows. And once again, with a tree pit, there may be a bypass for exceedance flows. So there may be some flows, one in 10 year storm event, or a 1 in 100-year storm event, that bypass that tree pit and go straight into the water environment. For those exceedance flows, you cannot claim any phosphorus capture or reduction because they haven't been treated. So this is just, I've already said this probably, but well, it's probably worth saying it again, why the figures are so low for dissolved phosphorus. And it's because in order to have certainty, we use the best management practice database 2020 summary document. And in that document, not all devices have a capture figure for dissolved phosphorus. So that will get better over time. We will get more data, and as we get more data, we will update the document, I hope.
Joe, we need to move things.
Sorry, I think that's me. That's
Thanks very much.
Yes, is that you now, Phil?
Yes, it is. That's me. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so Thank you. What I did as part of my part of the CIRIA report was to take the data that Joe and Louise and Phil, the other Phil, identified, and actually put it into a SuDS model. So if I was designing a traditional SuDS design, how would I, what would we be seeing actual reductions that Joe was talking about? So what we did is as I said, we used the infradrainage model. We actually modeled two versions of the site. So the first one was with the 1 year storm event between 5 minutes and 2 days. So the storm duration lasted between 5 minutes and 2 days. And the second one we did is we took our full years of rainfall data for the Creedon Hill Air Force Base and actually modeled that. So modeled how the SuDS systems would work for that full 1 year's worth of hydraulic data. We used a phosphorus loading of 0.41 milligrams per litre over a 1 litre hectare catchment. That is that matches up to work produced by Ricardo that identified that was the volume for this area. And then what we did is we arranged it into, we picked a number of the traditional SuDS features, so your bioretentions, ponds, various pavements, swales, rain gardens, and then we arranged it into 1, 2, or 3 different treatment stages. Let's see if we turn on that. There we go. So what our modeling identified that the SuDS was really
Phil, could you keep it as tight as possible, because we're beginning to run over a bit.
Yes, yeah, I'm finishing up now. Yeah, so the SuDS was really effective at intercepting and managing phosphorus. One of the critical things was was retention time within the green SuDS. So short, flashy storms, which cause the water to move through those green SuDS, the swales, the rain gardens, etc., quickly, actually had identified the minimum amount of pollution removal, whereas if a longer period storm and it didn't move through those green SuDS as quickly, you were maximizing the amount of phosphorus removal, which is obviously as most people would expect. Position as Joe said, where you position your SuDS features was also critical. So small scale SuDS was really good upstream, and then obviously the big scale, the ponds, floating wetland, were always better towards the end of the system, and they tended to pick up a lot of did a lot of the heavy lifting during more of the short flashy storms, whereas the rain gardens, the water went through them fairly quickly. And the critical thing we found by doing 1, 2, and 3 is that we found that the more treatment stages available provided more opportunity for the phosphorus to be captured, and also mitigated against the differences in the storm types, the hydrographs of the storms. So all we would say is that the precautionary approaches should be followed. What was produced is good practice for water quality management. But as Joe says, one of the key things that we need people out there. We need people out there testing it and proving and getting a lot of the data that we didn't have. And the other key thing is that these SuDS, especially the green one, all of it, is well managed. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Phil, Louise, and Joe. So our final presentation is going to be a case study, but before we just go on to that final presentation of the case study, just urge you to check the questions in the Q&A and do the thumbs up to like them if you think they chime with what you've been thinking, because when we come to the Q&A session, the easiest way for me to direct the questions is in terms of the prominence of the question, in terms of the support it's got, because we've got over 80 questions, and which is fantastic. But in order to make sure we make the best of the questions we've got, please can you prioritize your likes for the questions. Thanks so much. Anyway, moving on to our final presentation, case studies on nutrient neutrality solutions. We've got Martina Gerben, who's Senior Technical Director of Ecology for Arcadis, and also Ranuka Ganasakura, who's a Technical Director also of Water Management at Arcadis. So over to both of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. We will run through two case studies. The first one is a large development site known as Otopul Park. And then I will hand over to Martina to go through the second case study, which is Flintshire case study, which is in Wales. So you already heard several case studies through the day, but I guess the difference in this two presentations are one is looking at development site, and the other one is in a different geography. In Wales, what NRW does, and that kind of the information would be something different. But we are trying to aim that through taking integrated and strategic nature-based solutions, we believe it provides the flexibility and the ability to demonstrate the multifunctional benefits, which not only address the nutrient neutrality, but the biodiversity, addressing the climate emergency, and usually at less cost and providing great agility than the traditional solutions. So hopefully we can run through these two case studies. So this is Otopul Park, which is in South Kent, near to Folkestone. The site, the outline planning application aiming to deliver 8,500 homes, and the wider framework aims to deliver 10,000 homes and the infrastructure. The site promoter is Otopul Park LLP. You can see the stud marsh is further downstream, so we need to demonstrate that the nitrogen and phosphorus is no more than the current state to protect the European site. Stud marsh is a SAC as well as important SSSI. Not only nutrients, we have other pressures such as the environmental sensitivity of the AONB to the north and south, and the flood risk. For example, the Oldington Flood Storage Reservoir, which protects the Ashford, and we have precious concerns on the water resources. Generally it's a water stressed area. So all this needs to be looked at holistically through the master planning process. So we started looking at Otopul Park, helping the client to deliver the master plan, produce the master plan back in 2016. And we worked through the planning team, stakeholders, and submitted the outline planning application around 2019. And then we hit the new requirement of the nutrient neutrality from Natural England for stud marsh. So we need to start unraveling the problem and see what solutions could be delivered to overcome this. So we worked out the Newton budgets, initial solutions, and in late 2020, Natural England withdrew the objection to the local plan, and we sort of continued with the operational appraisal process. But then we submitted the planning application, a revised planning set of planning proposals in March 2022. Unfortunately, for our luck, and at the same time, the Natural England submitted the new guidance. So we need to revisit those proposals and submit some amendments to those. And we are hoping to achieve the outline planning in early next year, and then go through the detailed design. So the existing land uses are mainly arable, and the soil types are the southern part is freely draining soil, and the northern part is impeded drainage, whereas the water courses running through the site contains the natural wet soils. As you know, the Natural England calculator looks, you need to input the soil type and sensitivity to the rainfall intensities. But unfortunately, the calculator doesn't allow plugging in more than one soil types, for example. So we need to work through those constraints and then cut the site into different categories, and then apply the calculator several times to get the answer we need. We were quite we were working together to achieve nature-based designs at the beginning. To work on the environmental sensitivity, we were leading with the landscape design, but not only that, the design principles embedded delivering as much as natural capital and the ecosystem benefits from the word go. So we mapped the high quality ecological corridors, and then we protected them. And not only protected them, we took measures to enhance them, so we can achieve the maximum biodiversity. And then we looked at where we can put more additional design influences to bring the site and bring the maximum benefits. By doing this, we achieved across the site around 20% biodiversity net gain. We had over 50% of the site as green infrastructure. So the sketch, for example, shows here this is a section taken through the northern part of the site through the river park. The Rivers Tower, East Tower, has a shallow, wide floodplain. And then we have SuDS corridors and ecological corridors around it, providing that wider buffer. So initially we had the SuDS components integrated within this adjoining SuDS buffer. When we had the additional requirement to bring the neutrality, we worked with the team and incorporated additional wetlands in the shallow floodplain, so that it can function to provide the neutrality component, working alongside the SuDS on the wider landscape. The making space for water was a very important aspect for the development. So the development is set back, creating that space. You can see on the sketches, we have a number of bridge crossings, and the bridges have been landscaped to the surrounding ground with so that it's not an ISO. We maintain the dry access, wet access, so it can function for its uses not only during the dry times but also when the river is at flood. We looked at providing both on-site wastewater treatment work as well as off-site wastewater treatment works to provide the wastewater treatment. But after the option appraisal process, it was favored that on-site wastewater treatment work is the preferred in this instance. In particularly, once we hit the neutral requirement, it allows us to achieve the neutral neutrality using on-site measures at the space the developer can bring the development forward in a more integrated manner. One thing to also mention is by creating this additional space for water, it has a definite advantage because it also reducing the flood risk and provides more space for recharging the aquifers as well as the creating the water in the environment. This plan shows how the site is being developed. The brown color represents the main development areas, and the green areas are the main public open space, and the wetlands are being incorporated within the public open space, mainly alongside the watercourses. You may be already aware that for example, the sports pitches, things like that, you need to, although it is green infrastructure, you need to treat them as urban space in terms of the neutrality purpose, because they can generate higher nutrient exports. So this is our Otterpool current solution. Joe and Louise, talked about, we can now bring along the benefits of SuDS in terms of nutrient mitigation. Unfortunately, when we started this journey, when we had this dialogue with the Natural England at the time, we couldn't count the benefits from the SuDS at the time. But we know that SuDS can help. So we have a strategic network of SuDS, which will take the nutrients at the source and then slowly feed through the wider wetlands. And then it will remove the nutrients from the stormwater component. Alongside that, we have the wastewater wetland. You can see along the northwest corner, that is where the on-site wastewater treatment will be located. So we have number of wetlands to treat the nutrients from the on-site treatment work, and the two together it gives around 36 hectares of wetland. When we did the initial calculations to the original SuDS guide, it was about 50-50 split we had at the time, the stormwater and the wastewater split. But the new guidance meant that the stormwater component has increased about 25% more. So now we have what 70-30 split in terms of the wetland distribution. On top of that, we have the sort of structural landscaping, which will count for the woodland, that will provide additional benefits. All this in combination provides the ability to achieve the nutrient neutrality at Otterpool Park. Also, we kept the flexibility that if, for example, let's say the later phases, if you want to connect to the existing public water, the water treatment work, we can connect to the saline treatment work, which is about 1.2 kilometers away from the site. But unfortunately, this is one of those treatment works being investigated by the WINEP study for SuDS. So until the new upgrades are in place and there's a nutrient neutrality credit scheme in place, we are not able to connect to the treatment work. So in the meantime, we have a robust solution which we can deliver nutrient neutrality, but we don't have all the answers yet. It has to go through the detailed design as we go along. At this point, I will hand over to Martina.
Thanks very much, Renuka.
And I should say that Renuka and I work quite closely together on a number of projects. I head up ecology at Arcadis, but I also work predominantly in natural capital accounting, ecosystem services, and also looking at nature-based solutions. So we have had some great sort of introductions to the nutrient neutrality issue, so I won't go into this in too much detail, but basically in Wales we are in a similar situation whereby the existing discharge from phosphate into watercourses surrounding SACs are exceeding where the ecological tolerances lie. So NRW did bring in new targets and a compliance assessment which showed that there are exceedances in some areas, even with phosphate permitting limits not being exceeded, the sort of ecological tolerance was being exceeded. Now, this resulted in some local plan HRAs being frozen. So some of them had gone through the HRA process and the strategic environmental assessment process, and they were, all of the mitigations had been incorporated, except when this requirement was introduced, that put a halt to the determination and adoption of those plan HRAs. It also put a halt in the development of some developers and housing that had actually been already permitted. So Flintshire initially was our client who approached us, but then requested that we also work with their neighbouring Borough Council, County Council, which is Wrexham, and we were also going to work with some of their existing consultants on that. So the catchment that we're discussing is the River Dee catchment. And as you can see, there are exceedances or failures in that catchment, and there's some areas where there is not yet sufficient information for that failure. As you have also heard, we have not only the from the future development plans to consider in terms of phosphates, but the existing failures, which the reasons for not achieving good water status in the River Dee are largely agricultural than with wastewater discharges. So we've got all those additional water pressures as well. So looking at being nutrient neutral will obviously suffice for the HRA local development plan. However, we really need to go beyond that if we're going to reduce the pressure on these watercourses, because we are in exceedance at the moment. So looking at a solution, we already discussed that we were collaborating with Wrexham, because you need to look at these solutions in combination. And DTA, their consultants, we also were working together on a strategic plan. Nature-based solutions offer a huge amount of flexibility and multifunctional benefits, which we'll talk a little bit more about. There's also a need to look at what other innovative solutions are out there. And really, really importantly is work with other disciplines, because like ecologists don't know the answers, not just water specialists don't know the answers. We have to think about landscape architects, we have to think about other sort of community engagement and collaboration. So it's really a very holistic approach, which does offer a lot of flexibility. However, when you are looking at multiple benefits, multiple disbenefits, and lots of collaborators, that obviously means that you've got a lot of options and a lot of different people to talk to, which can potentially slow down some of that, the solution building. So what we decided to do while looking at the solution and obviously needing to get those local plans adopted relatively swiftly was separating these into two types of measures. The first kind of measure would be those that we could do a nutrient budget on, and we would be sure that those measures would actually allow enough headroom so that we could actually go ahead with the residential developments that we were budgeting. However, there's a real need to look at associated measures to reduce the pressure in the wider environment and really maximize every time we have a new development. What can we do? So what can we do on site? Can we improve the SuDS that are being delivered on site? Retrofitting, obviously, what funding is available for that retrofitting in the wider environment. And then there's a wide range of agricultural improvements that we can make to actually prevent the phosphate actually entering into the watercourses in the first place. potentially from buffer strips or just separating source control in farms. And then there's also looking at enhanced wastewater treatment, and we discussed those surface separations. So what we did was look at all of the people that were working in the river decatchment, all of the different stakeholders that maybe had some funding to improve water quality, as well as looking at the different types of efficiencies there were, types of solutions there were, and the efficiencies. And this document is actually available to download, so you can, as well as having these slides made available to you and possibly the recordings, you can also go and download the document. So we produced intervention measures matrix, and Joe was discussing previously, and it'd be really interesting to compare that guidance with what we've done. We reviewed hundreds of bits of literature, and Joe is quite right in that a lot of it was not directly comparable. So we tried to find temperate-based solutions that were published, as well as in the UK and the wider area, and looked at all the different potential interventions, what their advantages and disadvantages were, what their feasibility might be, and effectiveness, and who the delivery partners could be.
Martina, we're running a bit over. Can you speed things up a bit if possible?
Okay, I will indeed. And then there's time for questions, I think, at the end. So it was in Wales, it was an area with not very much guidance at the time we were brought in. Solutions, we were looking at a range of solutions, so buffering as well as constructed wetlands. But from doing our research, obviously the constructed wetlands were the ones that were more applicable, were more readily able to have greater confidence with the biggest efficiencies. So they were the solutions that we chose to actually focus on in terms of delivering those category 1 solutions that we talked about. However, the category 2 solutions are still incredibly important. That's pulling together all of the different potential opportunities in the area and setting up a nutrient management board. So while we've produced that strategy, now we're actually moving on to delivering the actual solutions that will work for Flintshire at the moment as well, and they're both evolving in parallel. On this one, I just want to quickly go through what we have 3 major areas where these constructed wetland solutions will potentially be applicable. We're looking at the costs and benefits of those in terms of environmental benefits as well as the direct costs. And there's an opportunity in this particular area in Buckley to actually also improve and manage what are the minute priority habitats on Magic, but there's no active management. So as well as we can actually increase the priority habitat. What is really important is that there is a site impact assessment. People talked about agricultural land, and absolutely we shouldn't be doing this on the best value agricultural land, but there's other things to consider, such as cultural heritage and what's already there if it is of importance, and for biodiversity. Lots of different things we have to look at. So my last slide. So while we're doing this, we're using the CIRIA Best tool, as well as actually bespoke natural capital accounting tools to look at the benefits and monetize those benefits, as well as looking at the costs. That will help us in this instance see what developer contributions would be appropriate, but also it will support other delivery partners that may want to implement these nature-based solutions, and it may release additional funding. But those multifunctional benefits that nature-based solutions can deliver are absolutely critical. It's also a flexible and agile way of managing the environment, because our needs may indeed change. So we're looking at the lowest impact for the maximum benefits. And I think the take home is that we're all doing fantastic things across the piece. The most important thing is that we do collaborate, share knowledge, and as we get more and more data, the confidence limits in these solutions will go up and up, which means that actually the area one has to do things. So the actual constructed wetlands, for example, may decrease. However, that doesn't mean that we should be maximising strategically the opportunity to increase water quality across all of our stakeholders and delivery partners. So exciting times ahead, and I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you. That was a very good couple of examples. And now we've done all the presentations and we've got a lot of questions. I'd like to get everybody who presented back up as a panel to address some of the questions that have been posed to us. So if you could unmute yourselves and put yourselves back on screen. I'll start with a fairly general question, which I think is still relevant. It was one of the ones that had a lot of support from this morning. Are new developments a significant contributor to nutrient pollution? What proportion comes from these as opposed to agriculture?
I can't remember. I can't remember the numbers. There's a pie chart, isn't it? And it's quite a small part of the pie chart, but
yeah,
certainly the runoff from residential developments, roofs and driveways and residential roads, the phosphorus content is low. So compared to the sewage component of phosphorus from a development and neighbouring agricultural land, the urban runoff from the urban surfaces is very low.
Anyone else want to say anything? I think you pretty well covered it, Jo.
I would just say in the research we've done, it is again largely the agricultural inputs, and then the wastewater treatment failure of things like combined sewage overflows and things like that. So it's a case of developing the right infrastructure, treatment and upgrades from the water companies, as well as the wider agriculture. It does seem at the minute that the developer element is sort of trying to solve all problems for all people. But I think, as I touched on in my talk, it's really important that we collaborate with all of the stakeholders, because there's huge opportunities to do much better, I think, which is the good thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I just add to that, Peter? I was just going to say that it's catchment specific, so it depends where. So we need to be looking at the current sources of where things are coming from, because it might be a mix of things. And then to put on top of that, what is the growth impact? And in a lot of cases, the growth impact is actually really quite small in comparison to other sources, but it needs to be catchment specific, because what might work in the southwest won't work in the northeast, and vice versa.
Thank you. Yes. I'll move on to the next question. This is aimed at you particularly, David. When calculating nutrient inputs to your constructed wetland, is there any point in using sample data, given that most nutrients are mobilised during flood events, and sampling doesn't happen during flood events due to health and safety concerns?
I mean, there's always a point there's always value in using whatever monitoring data you've got. So we'd certainly, the team, when we were looking at this, we were saying that always look at the sampling data and then see how representative it is. So that sometimes it's actually quite useful. It can be quite useful, and I agree. Sometimes if it's just based on one event and you can either miss it or capture it, then it's no use at all. So, I mean, the design, most of the designs I've been involved with to do sewage treatment works, polishing, effluent. So you've actually got quite good water quality data. What most of the guys in the team tended to do for that event-based pollution was estimate it based on the catchment and the land use and so forth. So they'd produce estimates like that rather than use the monitoring data. That tended to be what they said.
Thank you. Anyone else? I mean, that was primarily David, so I'm not expecting anybody, but I shall move on then. This is a bit of a devil's advocate question. If we're promoting SuDS so much for their multiple benefits, given there's so much missing evidence about their effectiveness, is it right to be so reliant on them from a legislative and planning perspective when it is a case of their value not being fully proven? Who would like to start on that one?
Well, I think we did touch on the precautionary principles. So we've actually, at each stage of everything, we've been really precautionary. So whether it's in the actual nutrient budget assessments and the efficiency of nature-based solutions, we've been really precautionary. I'm sure there's other people that want to touch upon that.
Yeah. If I add to that, I think, for example, the Autopool example, we didn't fully count the sort of nutrient benefits from the SuDS. So don't put, if at this stage, unless you have, pretty good evidence, don't put all the emphasis on the SuDS, keep your options broad. So, we got, a range of options you can tap on as the development, the design evolves. You have the ability to adapt your design accordingly. So, when the CIRIA SuDS guidance is, well and up and running, we could, bring the SuDS, more, but in the meantime, you need to have a holistic and balanced approach to the sort of approach.
Yeah, and Peter, can I just the data is missing for nutrients particularly, but we know that SuDS are excellent at capturing sediment, toxic metals. We know that biodegradation of polyaromatic hydrocarbons works to some extent. We also know they're fabulous at flood risk management and creating habitats for wildlife and creating pleasing places for people to spend time in nature. So the multiple benefits of SuDS are known and measured and magnificent. The gap in the data really is around nutrients, because we've never focused on nutrient pollution in England and before. I mean, in Australia, they've always been focused on nutrient pollution. It's fairly new to us. So it's a little gap in the data, but we've got a huge wealth of all the other data. So SuDS are fab, and we know that. It's just this little gap.
Yeah, I think that question also, the questioner said this design focuses on larger storm events. It doesn't. We're just designing in exceedance because of the particular element that we're looking at, that we don't want to remobilize phosphorus during heavy storm, but we're not focusing on large storm events. We're still focusing on achieving multiple benefits, including water quality.
And that's sort of just to enhance that. That was one of the reasons why I tried to do the two models, the one that was just based on a storm event and one that was based on your typical rainfall for the entire year. So the modeling that was done took from March till March, every single rainfall event that happened for 2021.
Thanks. Anyone else want to say anything on that one? Next question that I've got here is one that's quite close to my own heart in terms of collaboration and cooperation. And the question is, how are cross-boundary approaches being tackled where impacted catchments cross local planning authority boundaries, and issues of cumulative risks to achieving nutrient neutrality, or opportunities for compounding benefits of mitigation, to ensure that there's some consistency of approach and schemes actually work properly on a wider basis. I mean, this is an issue that goes through a lot of planning issues. The cooperation between authorities who are designing schemes and writing plans.
I think that collaboration is really important, and groups like CIRIA, for example, who are reaching out to a wide range of the councils, different clients, different collaborators. I think that's really important that we do that.
Yeah.
I would add that the setting up of nutrient management boards in those impacted catchments will promote that the collaboration approach, so everybody works together. You can't solve the problems day one, but it may be that as long as you take the strategic approach, you could phase out the developments coming online, and then use the intervention before it impacts the sort of the receptor, shall we say. So you still have different solutions you can bring, regardless whether it's one authority or another. We work as a sort of a team, and then bring that the coordinated approach.
Yeah. Anyone else want to chip in on that? Yeah, David and Rachel.
I would, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I love the catchment-based approach so much, because when we've been working with various different local authorities, we always look upstream outside their area and downstream to see the connectivity through. So that's I think that's one of the strengths of working with the catchment-based approach partners, is they provide that kind of connection across those boundaries.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree with that. Rachel, did you want to chip in?
Yeah, just to say that the money, the support for local authorities for nutrient neutrality catchments, that's come forward on catchment basis. So it's looking at local planning authorities within that catchment all working together to deliver the projects. Many have set up working groups and are obviously working across boundary. Where we have had strategic mitigation in areas outside of where the development is coming forward, that joint legal agreements between local authorities have progressed in the Solent and other areas, so that you can deliver that strategic mitigation that can be applicable to other areas. So that kind of joint working is happening in certain areas and is leading to that further collaboration, which I think is really helpful.
Yeah, it's really positive. Thank you. Anyone else? I think we've pretty well covered that one. Next one is about, well, I'll read it out rather than trying to summarize it. That's much more sensible. By developing land, you're draining new surfaces. So if developing an agricultural piece of land that may be contaminated, so if you were developing an agricultural land that may be contaminated, would you be reducing contamination and not need mitigation, as the runoff will be cleaner?
I think we do take account of land use change in the nutrient budget calculations, but I don't know, Renuka, whether you want to answer that one.
I think this was partly covered in a previous question. Simon, I think mentioned. We capture the change of land use in the nutrient budget. It will help to a lesser nutrient budget, but you will still need some extra mitigation. Depends on what's the magnitude of that nutrient budget is. So yeah, it is part of the problem, but whether you call it as the whole mitigation is another matter. But it may be that change of land use will be a mitigation in a catchment scale if you can identify strategic locations to change the land use and provide the strategic mitigation. But within the site itself, it's unlikely that you can achieve the 100% nutrient neutrality by changing of land use.
Thank you. Anything else? The next question that I've got is how do cover crops and land fallowing provide mitigation as a temporary solution? Who'd like to have a go at that one?
I can have a go at that. So that's what Wiltshire is using as our temporary measures. So we have it's based on farm scope and modelling, which looks at the benefits that you have for that year for putting in a temporary cover crop rather than having bare soil. So you're effectively reducing the runoff that comes forward from that field, and that element leads to a benefit, and from that benefit we can then help offset development. So it's a temporary measure. It's not something that we can do permanently because you can't control where those cover crops come in each year. So it's only a very much temporary measure, but we've been working actually with Entrade in doing those calculations and with the local farm and cluster groups as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, I'll move on. This is an interesting one. Sediment removal from ponds. Do you have to show that that the sediment will be deposited outside the catchment to prevent release of the phosphates? Who'd like to have a go at that?
I can come in on that to start with. The important thing is to demonstrate that that those nutrients are being used in place of a different nutrient source. So you could theoretically use those nutrients within the catchment, as long as you could demonstrate that if you weren't using those nutrients, there'd be some imported fertilizer being applied to that same piece of land, for example. So you just need to demonstrate that they're not acting as additional nutrients, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? I think that's a very good answer. Right. This is a particular one about the guidance. So it's a previous CIRIA guidance allows for 80% plus removal for bioretention zones. Has this advice been withdrawn?
No. This is the problem with having this disconnect between the CIRIA SuDS manual and the American BMP database, and it will be resolved. I hope we can resolve it with the new iteration of the SuDS manual, and I hope Louise is still on the call and she can tell us that'll be next Thursday. But I doubt it. But I in all seriousness, the next iteration of the CIRIA SuDS manual is being considered and developed. It's at early days at the moment, but certainly the intention is that we will resolve this problem of this mismatch between the two documents at that point. Yeah. Bioretention zones, there is lots of evidence from all around the world, and it's, you know, which evidence did we use? It was a tricky call, and maybe we got it wrong. I don't know, but we did our best. But certainly we'll fix that mismatch as the new SuDS manual is or the new addendum or iteration of the SuDS manual is brought out.
Thank you very much. If no one else has got anything else on that, I don't think you probably have. This next question is an interesting one. Given nutrient neutrality as a result of European case law, which may no longer be directly enforceable in the UK after the retained EU law bill, and given the pressure it's putting on the politically sensitive issue of house building, and given the priorities this government has about getting rid of EU legislation and house building, how confident are we that the nutrient neutrality in its current form will continue to be enforced in the UK? Who'd like to start on that one?
I can add some thoughts if you like to start.
Yes, please,
start for 10. Nutrients is one of the planetary boundaries that are being exceeded at the moment, and climate change is further exacerbating the negative effect of nutrients. So whatever the legislation sort of turns out to be, the fact that if we don't do something about the nutrient status of our waters, we are going to, you know, lose more and more biodiversity. We're going to have more and more issues. And as also, I think it was Louise was saying, phosphate's a limiting resource. So we're going to have to start harvesting phosphate. Yeah. And some of these nature-based solutions give it a really excellent opportunity for us to actually harvest phosphate as well. So the legislative and policy framework is very dynamic. But I think if you look to ecosystems, resilience and planetary boundaries, I don't think this will be going away. I think it will be something that we will look to more actually rather than less.
Yeah, thank you. Would anyone else like to say anything on that one? Or are you all steering clear of it?
I would highlight that there are numerous government commitments unrelated to European legislation around condition of designated sites and species diversity and all of those important issues that, whilst they don't specifically relate to the nutrients issue, ensuring that our water dependent sites are in good condition is required in order for the government to meet those objectives. I wouldn't want to say anything about any plans the government may or may not have about legislative reform of EU regulation. I don't think that would be appropriate.
We do also have our the targets, the environmental targets for improved water quality consultation, and in Wales, for example, there is a duty for public authorities to conserve ecosystem function as well. So there's quite a lot of existing legislation and policy around water quality issues too.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next one then. And this one is, I think, primarily for Rachel, but obviously everybody else can put something in if they can. Is there a danger that planning permission is given for development based on wetland mitigation, which is then proven to be inadequate, but the housing is built and there? What powers would a local planning authority have to deal with that?
So for any permission where we're permitting SuDS, for example, on a development site, we would be, as a local authority, looking to ensure that all of the assessment is done in line with the guidance, and then the local authority has an obligation then to ensure that what is planned is then secured with a permission. So for development SuDS on site, an example, or another wetland, we would be looking for management and monitoring in perpetuity. So we would have to make sure we had those agreements in place, and we had the obligation, therefore, to continue to monitor that as a council. So one of the things that is often overlooked with SuDS is A, that long-term management, and B, the monitoring from the local authority. So where these systems will be used for nutrient neutrality, we will be obliged as competent authority to make sure that that is secured. If it's not secured, then we will have to make sure that we have got powers for enforcement. I accept that we wouldn't be able to remove people from houses under other, what would be very difficult to, but we would be looking to make sure that that permission secured the right measures and we had powers of enforcement to do so. But all of the work that everyone has been doing is very precautionary in terms of the figures, and I think that's where we hope that we have got capacity in the system, in that we haven't over-egged the figures, as it were, and therefore, we are doing the permissions on the best available evidence. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, that was right. I think Rachel's covered it. David, sorry, you had your hand up.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we were so keen to be involved in the framework, so that, there was proper design criteria was set out, so that wetlands didn't fail to deliver what they were intended to. So I think that's, that's been the whole thrust of this guidance that Natural England have been funding, really.
Thank you. Yeah, Renu, could you've got your hand up?
Yeah, just to add, I think the Schedule 3 is you said the legislative changes. I think this adds to the weight. I think unless we grapple the problem now at the top level, this problem is only going to create undesirable effects down the line, because there is not enough resources. So the focus is given to make sure these facilities are adopted in perpetuity. So yeah, it's another reason probably we all should lobby to the government.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm gonna start pulling things together now, because we're getting to the end of our allotted time, and before we do, Louise, do you know whether we're able to answer the questions? We've got a lot of questions we haven't answered here yet. Are we able to answer these in a way that people could see the answers later?
Yes, we'll collate them. We'll send them round to the panelists, the ones that haven't been answered, and then we can send a follow-up email to the to everybody that's registered.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, that's great, because said we've had a tremendous reaction from the audience. We got some fantastic questions. I mean, I could go on for another hour with the questions that we've got, and I'd like to, but we are running out of time. So I think it's time that I summed up and let you all go home. So I'm just thinking about what we've done today. I mean, this is a very complex issue. There's lots of conflicts. There's lots of trade-offs, but I think we are making progress. I mean, what I've heard today is incredibly encouraging, and it's certainly moved on a heck of a long way since it started rearing its head, as I said, about certainly within government about 15 years ago, or those of us who are advising government started raising it. And the planning system, as Rachel showed us, is really getting to grips with this. And as Simon said, we're getting a pragmatic approach from the regulators, and the water companies are really, I think, on it as well, and they obviously need to be. The guidance that CIRIA has put out, I think, is a really good step in the right direction, and bringing that into the SuDS guidance is a really positive step. So things are looking really positive going forward, I think. I think the way forward is certainly leaning towards nature-based solutions and SuDS. And I mean, we need to remember the multiple benefits that because these wetlands, SuDS, they have tremendous benefits in terms of reducing nutrient pollution and achieving nutrient neutrality. But we mustn't forget that they also have these other multiple benefits, managing surface water, the health and well-being benefits for the community. Those are really becoming well demonstrated now, and also the biodiversity gains. So not only do we fix or get a long way along the road to fixing the nutrient neutrality issue, but we've also got all of these other benefits as well. And before I finally wrap up, I'd just like to remind you again that if you've got an opportunity to get your MP to lobby ministers, or get if your MP is a minister, to lobby them directly, to point out the value of SuDS in all these areas, and particularly in terms of nutrient neutrality, so that they're favourably disposed to giving it a tick in the ministerial right round. Giving the Schedule 3 implementation proposals which DEFRA are putting forward, to giving them a tick in the ministerial right round, because this is our last chance, I think, with this, and it's on a knife edge. And if enough ministers can be persuaded that it's a good thing, then we've got it. But if they're not persuaded, then we're back to the drawing board. Anyway, I want to leave on a positive aspect and say thank you all very much indeed, and thank you to our tremendous audience. I mean, the amount of interest in the questions has just been staggering. It's been a real pleasure chairing this, and say thanks again to our audience and our wonderful presenters.
Thanks, Peter, for fabulous chairing. I've just got a couple of very small announcements. Relevant projects, please do have a look at them, that we are either ongoing or we're looking to start. Please contact me or one of the CIRIA team if you're interested. There is a survey on the update to the SuDS manual that was mentioned. The link is here. We'll share that afterwards too. And we have communities of practice within CIRIA. If you're interested in getting involved with those, please do get in contact with us. And thanks everyone for joining. It's been a really good afternoon. Oh yes, our benefits estimation tool will launch next year as well. Great webinar, great sharing, Peter, and great messages about the multiple benefits of SuDS. So thank you all.
Thank you.